staircase, Cedric was at the top. He was with a load of 6th-year friends. Harry didn't want to talk to Cedric in front of them. They were among those who had been quoting Rita Skeeter's article at him every time he went near them. He followed Cedric at a distance, and saw that he was heading toward the charms corridor. This gave Harry an idea. Pausing at a distance from them, he pulled out his wand and took careful aim. Diffindo! Cedric's bag split. Parchment, quills, and books spilled out of it onto the floor. Several bottles of ink smashed. "Don't bother," said Cedric in an exasperated voice as his friends bent down to help him. "Tell Flitwick I'm coming. Go on." This was exactly what Harry had been hoping for. He slipped his wand back into his robes, waited until Cedric's friends had disappeared into their classroom, and hurried up the corridor, which was now empty of everyone but himself and Cedric. "Hi," said Cedric, picking up a copy of a Guide to Advanced Transfiguration that was now splattered with ink. "My bag just split, brand new and all." "Cedric," said Harry, "the first task is dragons." "What?" said Cedric, looking up. "Dragons," said Harry, speaking quickly in case Professor Flitwick came out to see where Cedric had got to. "They've got 4, one for each of us, and we've got to get past them." Cedric stared at him. Harry saw some of the panic he'd been feeling since Saturday night flickering in Cedric's gray eyes. "Are you sure?" Cedric said in a hushed voice. "Dead sure," said Harry. "I've seen them." "But how did you find out?" "We're not supposed to know." "Never mind," said Harry quickly. He knew Hagrid would be in trouble if he told the truth. "But I'm not the only one who knows. Fleur and Krum will know by now. Maxime and Karkaroff both saw the dragons too." Cedric straightened up, his arms full of inky quills, parchment, and books, his ripped bag dangling off one shoulder. He stared at Harry, and there was a puzzled, almost suspicious look in his eyes. "Why are you telling me?" he asked. Harry looked at him in disbelief. He was sure Cedric wouldn't have asked that if he had seen the dragons himself. Harry wouldn't have let his worst enemy face those monsters unprepared. Well, perhaps Malfoy or Snape. "It's just fair, isn't it?" he said to Cedric. "We all know now. We're on an even footing, are we?" Cedric was still looking at him in a slightly suspicious way when Harry heard a familiar clunking noise behind him. He turned around and saw Mad-Eye Moody emerging from a nearby classroom. "Come with me, Potter," he growled. "Diggory, off you go." Harry stared apprehensively at Moody. Had he overheard them? Professor, I'm supposed to be in herbology." "Never mind that, Potter. In my office, please." Harry followed him, wondering what was going to happen to him now. What if Moody wanted to know how he'd found out about the dragons? Would Moody go to Dumbledore and tell on Hagrid, or just turn Harry into a ferret? Well, it might be easier to get past a dragon if he were a ferret, Harry thought dully. He'd be smaller, much less easy to see from a height of 50 feet. He followed Moody into his office. Moody closed the door behind them and turned to look at Harry, his magical eye fixed upon him as well as the normal one. "That was a very decent thing you just did, Potter," Moody said quietly. Harry didn't know what to say. This wasn't the reaction he had expected at all. "Sit down," said Moody, and Harry sat, looking around. He had visited this office under 2 of its previous occupants. In Professor Lockhart's day, the walls had been plastered with beaming, winking pictures of Professor Lockhart himself. When Lupin had lived here, you were more likely to come across a specimen of some fascinating new dark creature he had procured for them to study in class. Now, however, the office was full of a number of exceptionally odd objects that Harry supposed Moody had used in the days when he had been in Auror. On his desk stood what looked like a large, cracked glass spinning top. Harry recognized it at once as a sneakoscope, because he owned one himself, though it was much smaller than Moody's. In the corner on a small table stood an object that looked something like an extra squiggly golden television aerial. It was humming slightly. What appeared to be a mirror hung opposite Harry on the wall, but it was not reflecting the room. Shadowy figures were moving around inside it, none of them clearly in focus. "Like my dark detectors, do you?" said Moody, who was watching Harry closely. "What's that?" Harry asked, pointing at the squiggly golden aerial. "Secrecy sensor. Vibrates when it detects concealment and lies. No use here, of course. Too much interference. Students in every direction lying about why they haven't done their homework. Been humming ever since I got here. I had to disable my sneakoscope because it wouldn't stop whistling. It's extra sensitive. Picks up stuff about a mile around. Of course, it could be picking up more than kid stuff," he added in a growl. "And what's the mirror for?" "Oh, that's my full glass. See them out there skulking around? I'm not really in trouble until I see the whites of their eyes. That's when I open my truck." He let out a short, harsh laugh and pointed to the large trunk under the window. It had 7 keyholes in a row. Harry wondered what was in there until Moody's next question brought him sharply back to earth. "So, found out about the dragons, have you?" Harry hesitated. He'd been afraid of this, but he hadn't told Cedric, and he certainly wasn't going to tell Moody that Hagrid had broken the rules. "It's all right," said Moody, sitting down and stretching out his wooden leg with a groan. "Cheating's a traditional part of the Triwizard Tournament, and always has been." "I didn't cheat," said Harry sharply. "It was a sort of accident that I found out." Moody grinned. "I wasn't accusing you, laddie. I've been telling Dumbledore from the start he can be as high-minded as he likes, but you can bet old Karkaroff and Maxime won't be. They'll have told their champions everything they can. They want to win. They want to beat Dumbledore. They'd like to prove he's only human." Moody gave another harsh laugh, and his magical eyes swiveled around so fast it made Harry feel queasy to watch it. "So, got any ideas how you're going to get past your dragon yet?" said Moody. "No," said Harry. "Well, I'm not going to tell you," said Moody gruffly. "I don't show favoritism, me. I'm just going to give you some good general advice. And the first bit is, play to your strengths." "I haven't got any," said Harry before he could stop himself. "Excuse me," growled Moody. "You've got strengths if I say you've got them. Think now. What are you best at?" Harry tried to concentrate. What was he best at? Wow, that was easy, really. "Quidditch," he said dully. "And a fat lot of help." "That's right," said Moody, staring at him very hard, his magical eye barely moving at all. "You're a damn good flyer from what I've heard." "Yeah, but—" Harry stared at him. "I'm not allowed a broom. I've only got my second piece of general advice," said Moody loudly, interrupting him, "is to use a nice, simple spell that will enable you to get what you need." Harry looked at him blankly. What did he need? "Come on, boy," whispered Moody. "Put them together. It's not that difficult." And it clicked. He was best at flying. He needed to pass the dragon in the air. For that, he needed his firebolt. And for his firebolt, he needed— "Hermione," Harry whispered when he had sped into Greenhouse 3 minutes later, uttering a hurried apology to Professor Sprout as he passed her. "Hermione, I need you to help me." "What do you think I've been trying to do, Harry?" she whispered back, her eyes round with anxiety over the top of the quivering flutterby bush she was pruning. "Hermione, I need to learn how to do a summoning charm properly by tomorrow afternoon." And so they practiced. They didn't have lunch, but headed for a free classroom, where Harry tried with all his might to make various objects fly across the room toward him. He was still having problems. The books and quills kept losing heart halfway across the room and dropping like stones to the floor. "Concentrate, Harry, concentrate! What do you think I'm trying to do?" said Harry angrily. "A great big dragon keeps popping up in my head for some reason." "Okay, try again." He wanted to skip divination to keep practicing, but Hermione refused point blank to skive off arithmancy, and there was no point in staying without her. He therefore had to endure over an hour of Professor Trelawney, who spent half the lesson telling everyone that the position of Mars with relation to Saturn at that moment meant that people born in July were in great danger of sudden, violent deaths. "Well, that's good," said Harry loudly, his temper getting the better of him. "Just as long as it's not drawn out. I don't want to suffer." Ron looked for a moment as though he was going to laugh. He certainly caught Harry's eye for the first time in days, but Harry was still feeling too resentful toward Ron to care. He spent the rest of the lesson trying to attract small objects toward him onto the table with his wand. He managed to make a fly zoom straight into his hand, though he wasn't entirely sure that was his prowess at summoning charms. Perhaps the fly was just stupid. He forced down some dinner after divination, then returned to the empty classroom with Hermione, using the invisibility cloak to avoid the teachers. They kept practicing until past midnight. They would have stayed longer, but Peeves turned up, and pretending to think that Harry wanted things thrown at him, started chucking chairs across the room. Harry and Hermione left in a hurry before the noise attracted Filch, and went back to the Gryffindor common room, which was now mercifully empty. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Harry stood near the fireplace, surrounded by heaps of objects, books, quills, several upturned chairs, an old set of gobstones, and Neville's toad Trevor. Only in the last hour had Harry really got the hang of the summoning charm. "That's better, Harry. That's loads better," Hermione said, looking exhausted but very pleased. "Well, now we know what to do next time I can manage a spell," Harry said, throwing a rune dictionary back to Hermione so he could try again. "Threaten me with a dragon." "Right." He raised his wand once more. "Osseo Dictionary." The heavy book soared out of Hermione's hand, flew across the room, and Harry caught it. "Harry, I really think you've got it," said Hermione delightedly. "Just as long as it works tomorrow," Harry said. "The firebolt's going to be much farther away than the stuff in here. It's going to be in the castle, and I'm going to be out there on the grounds." "That doesn't matter," said Hermione firmly. "Just as long as you're concentrating really, really hard on it, it'll come. Harry, we'd better get some sleep. You're going to need it." Harry had been focusing so hard on learning the summoning charm that evening that some of his blind panic had left him. It returned in full measure, however, on the following morning. The atmosphere in the school was one of great tension and excitement. Lessons were to stop at midday, giving all the students time to get down to the dragon's enclosure, though of course they didn't yet know what they would find there. Harry felt oddly separate from everyone around him, whether they were wishing him good luck or hissing, "We'll have a box of tissues ready, Potter," as he passed. It was a state of nervousness so advanced that he wondered whether he mightn't just lose his head when they tried to lead him out to his dragon and start trying to curse everyone in sight. Time was behaving in a more peculiar fashion than ever, rushing past in great dollops, so that one moment he seemed to be sitting down in his first lesson, History of Magic, and the next walking into lunch. And then, where had the morning gone? The last of the dragon-free hours. Professor McGonagall was hurrying over to him in the Great Hall. Lots of people were watching. "Potter, the champions have come down onto the grounds now. You have to get ready for your first task." "Okay," said Harry, standing up, his fork falling onto his plate with a clatter. "Like luck, Harry," Hermione whispered. "You'll be fine." "Yeah," said Harry, in a voice that was most unlike his own. He left the Great Hall with Professor McGonagall. She didn't seem herself either. In fact, she looked nearly as anxious as Hermione. As she walked him down the stone steps and out into the cold November afternoon, she put her hand on his shoulder. "Now don't panic," she said. "Just keep a cool head. We've got wizards standing by to control the situation if it gets out of hand. The main thing is just to do your best, and nobody will think any the worse of you. Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry heard himself say. "Yes, I'm fine." She was leading him toward the place where the dragons were, around the edge of the forest. But when they approached the clump of trees behind which the enclosure would be clearly visible, Harry saw that a tent had been erected, its entrance facing them, screening the dragons from view. "You're to go in here with the other champions," said Professor McGonagall in a rather shaky sort of voice, "and wait for your turn, Potter. Mr. Bagman is in there. He'll be telling you the procedure. Good luck." "Thanks," said Harry in a flat, distant voice. She left him at the entrance of the tent. Harry went inside. Fleur Delacour was sitting in a corner on a low wooden stool. She didn't look nearly as composed as usual, but rather pale and clammy. Victor Crumb looked even surlier than usual, which Harry supposed was his way of showing nerves. Cedric was pacing up and down. When Harry entered, Cedric gave him a small smile, which Harry returned, feeling the muscles in his face working rather hard, as though they had forgotten how to do it. "Harry, good-o," said Bagman happily, looking around at him. Come in, make yourself at home." Bagman looked somehow like a slightly overblown cartoon figure, standing amid all the pale-faced champions. He was wearing his old wasp robes again. "Well, now we're all here, time to fill you in," said Bagman brightly. "When the audience is assembled, I'm going to be offering each of you this bag." He held up a small sack of purple silk and shook it at them. "From which you will each select a small model of the thing you are about to face. There are different, varieties, you see. And I have to tell you something else, too. Ah, yes. Your task is to collect the golden egg." Harry glanced around. Cedric had nodded once, to show that he understood Bagman's words, and then started pacing around the tent again. He looked slightly green. Fleur Delacour and Crumb hadn't reacted at all. Perhaps they thought they might be sick if they opened their mouths. That was certainly how Harry felt, but they at least had volunteered for this. And in no time at all, hundreds upon hundreds of pairs of feet could be heard passing the tent, their owners talking excitedly, laughing, joking. Harry felt as separate from the crowd as though they were a different species. And then, it seemed like about a second later to Harry, Bagman was opening the neck of the purple silk sack. "Ladies first," he said, offering it to Fleur Delacour. She put a shaking hand inside the bag and drew out a tiny, perfect model of a dragon. A Welsh green. It had the number 2 around its neck. And Harry knew, by the fact that Fleur showed no sign of surprise, but rather a determined resignation, that he had been right. Madame Maxime had told her what was coming. The same held true for Crumb. He pulled out the scarlet Chinese fireball. It had the number 3 around its neck. He didn't even blink, just sat back down and stared at the ground. Cedric put his hand into the bag, and out came the bluish-gray Swedish short snout, the number 1 tied around its neck. Knowing what was left, Harry put his hand into the silk bag and pulled out the Hungarian wormtail, and the number 4. It stretched its wings as he looked down at it, and bared its minuscule fangs. "Well, there you are," said Bagman. "You have each pulled out the dragon you will face, and the numbers refer to the order in which you are to take on the dragons. Do you see? Now I'm going to have to leave you in a moment, because I'm commentating. Mr. Diggory, you're first. Just go out into the enclosure when you hear a whistle, all right? Now, Harry, could I have a quick word? Outside?" Yes," said Harry blankly, and he got up and went out of the tent with Bagman, who walked him a short distance away into the trees, and then turned to him with a fatherly expression on his face. "Feeling all right, Harry?" Anything I can get you?" "What?" said Harry. No, nothing." "Got a plan?" said Bagman, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Because I don't mind sharing a few pointers if you'd like them, you know. I mean," Bagman continued, lowering his voice still further, "you're the underdog here, Harry. Anything I can do to help—" "No," said Harry so quickly he knew he had sounded rude. "No, I know what I'm going to do, thanks." "Nobody would know, Harry," said Bagman, winking at him. "No, I'm fine," said Harry, wondering why he kept telling people this, and wondering whether he had ever been less fine. "I've got a plan worked out. A whistle had blown somewhere. "Good Lord, I've got to run," said Bagman in alarm, and he hurried off. Harry walked back to the tent and saw Cedric emerging from it, greener than ever. Harry tried to wish him luck as he walked past, but all that came out of his mouth was a sort of hoarse grunt. Harry went back inside to Fleur and Crumb. Seconds later they heard the roar of the crowd, which meant Cedric had entered the enclosure and was now face to face with the living counterpart of his model. It was worse than Harry could ever have imagined, sitting there and listening. The crowd screamed, yelled, gasped like a single many-headed entity, as Cedric did whatever he was doing to get past the Swedish short-snout. Crumb was still staring at the ground. Fleur had now taken to retracing Cedric's steps, around and around the tent, and Bagman's commentary made everything much, much worse. Horrible pictures formed in Harry's mind as he heard, "Ooh, narrow miss there, very narrow. He's taking risks, this one. Clever move. Pity it didn't work." And then, after about 15 minutes, Harry heard the deafening roar that could only mean one thing. Cedric had gotten past his dragon and captured the golden egg. "Very good indeed," Bagman was shouting. "And now the marks from the judges." But he didn't shout out the marks. Harry supposed the judges were holding them up and showing them to the crowd. "1 down, 3 to go," Bagman yelled as the whistle blew again. "Miss Delacour, if you please." Fleur was trembling from head to foot. Harry felt more warmly toward her than he had done so far as she left the tent with her head held high and her hand clutching her wand. He and Crumb were left alone at opposite sides of the tent, avoiding each other's gaze. The same process started again. "Oh, I'm not sure that was wise," they could hear Bagman shouting gleefully. "Oh, nearly. Careful now. Good Lord, I thought she'd had it then." 10 minutes later, Harry heard the crowd erupt into applause once more. Fleur must have been successful too. A pause while Fleur's marks were being shown. More clapping. Then, for the third time, the whistle. "And here comes Mr. Crumb!" cried Bagman, and Crumb slouched out, leaving Harry quite alone. He felt much more aware of his body than usual, very aware of the way his heart was pumping fast, and his fingers tingling with fear. Yet at the same time, he seemed to be outside himself, seeing the walls of the tent, and hearing the crowd as though from far away. "Very daring," Bagman was yelling, and Harry heard the Chinese fireball emit a horrible roaring shriek while the crowd drew its collective breath. "That's some nerve he's showing, and yes, he's got the egg." Applause shattered the wintry air like breaking glass. Crumb had finished. It would be Harry's turn any moment. He stood up, noticing dimly that his legs seemed to be made of marshmallow. He waited, and then he heard the whistle blow. He walked out through the entrance of the tent, the panic rising into a crescendo inside him, and now he was walking past the trees, through a gap in the enclosure fence. He saw everything in front of him as though it was a very highly colored dream. There were hundreds and hundreds of faces staring down at him from stands that had been magicked there since he'd last stood on this spot. And there was the horntail, at the other end of the enclosure, crouched low over her clutch of eggs, her wings half furled, her evil yellow eyes upon him, a monstrous, scaly black lizard, thrashing her spiked tail, leaving yard-long gouge marks in the hard ground. The crowd was making a great deal of noise, but whether friendly or not, Harry didn't know or care. It was time to do what he had to do, to focus his mind entirely and absolutely upon the thing that was his only chance. He raised his wand. "Accio firebolt!" he shouted. Harry waited, every fiber of him hoping, praying. If it hadn't worked, if it wasn't coming. He seemed to be looking at everything around him through some sort of shimmering, transparent barrier, like a heat haze, which made the enclosure and the hundreds of faces around him swim strangely. And then he heard it, speeding through the air behind him. He turned and saw his firebolt hurtling toward him around the edge of the woods, soaring into the enclosure and stopping dead in midair beside him, waiting for him to mount. The crowd was making even more noise. Bagman was shouting something, but Harry's ears were not working properly anymore. Listening wasn't important. He swung his leg over the broom and kicked off from the ground. And a second later, something miraculous happened. As he soared upward, as the wind rushed through his hair, as the crowd's faces became mere flesh-colored pinpricks below, and the horntail shrank to the size of a dog, he realized that he had left not only the ground behind, but also his fear. He was back where he belonged. This was just another Quidditch match, that was all. Just another Quidditch match, and that horntail was just another ugly opposing team. He looked down at the clutch of eggs and spotted the gold one, gleaming against its cement-colored fellows, residing safely between the dragon's front legs. Okay, Harry told himself. Diversionary tactics. Let's go. He dived. The horntail's head followed him. He knew what it was going to do and pulled out of the dive just in time. A jet of fire had been released exactly where he would have been had he not swerved away. But Harry didn't care. That was no more than dodging a bludger. "Great Scott, he can fly!" yelled Bagman as the crowd shrieked and gasped. "Are you watching this, Mr. Crumb?" Harry soared higher in a circle. The horntail was still following his progress, its head revolving on its long neck. If he kept this up, it would be nicely dizzy. But better not push it too long, or it would be breathing fire again. Harry plummeted just as the horntail opened its mouth. But this time he was less lucky. He missed the flames, but the tail came whipping up to meet him instead, and as he swerved to the left, one of the long spikes grazed his shoulder, ripping his robes. He could feel it stinging. He could hear screaming and groans from the crowd, but the cut didn't seem to be deep. Now he zoomed around the back of the horntail, and a possibility occurred to him. The horntail didn't seem to want to take off. She was too protective of her eggs, though she writhed and twisted, furling and unfurling her wings and keeping those fearsome yellow eyes on Harry. She was afraid to move too far from them. But he had to persuade her to do it, or he'd never get near them. The trick was to do it carefully, gradually. He began to fly, first this way, then the other, not near enough to make her breathe fire to stave him off, but still posing a sufficient threat to ensure she kept her eyes on him. Her head swayed this way and that, watching him out of those vertical pupils, her fangs bared. He flew higher. The horntail's head rose with him, her neck now stretched to its fullest extent, still swaying, like a snake before its charmer. Harry rose a few more feet, and she let out a roar of exasperation. He was like a fly to her, a fly she was longing to swat. Her tail thrashed again, but he was too high to reach now. She shot fire into the air, which he dodged. Her jaws opened wide. "Come on!" Harry hissed, swerving tantalizingly above her. "Come on! Come and get me! Up you get now!" And then she reared, spreading her great black leathery wings at last, as wide as those of a small airplane. And Harry dived. Before the dragon knew what he had done, or where he had disappeared to, he was speeding toward the ground as fast as he could go, toward the eggs now unprotected by her clawed front legs. He had taken his hands off his firebolt. He had seized the golden egg. And with a huge spurt of speed he was off. He was soaring out over the stands, the heavy egg safely under his uninjured arm. And it was as though somebody had just turned the volume back up. For the first time he became properly aware of the noise of the crowd, which was screaming and applauding as loudly as the Irish supporters at the World Cup. "Look at that!" Bagman was yelling. "Will you look at that? Our youngest champion is quickest to get his egg. Well, this is going to shorten the odds on Mr. Potter." Harry saw the dragon keepers rushing forward to subdue the horntail. And over at the entrance to the enclosure, Professor McGonagall, Professor Moody, and Hagrid hurrying to meet him, all of them waving him toward them, their smiles evident even from this distance. He flew back over the stands, the noise of the crowd pounding his eardrums, and came in smoothly to land, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He had got through the first task. He had survived. "That was excellent, Potter," cried Professor McGonagall as he got off the firebolt, which from her was extravagant praise. He noticed that her hand shook as she pointed at his shoulder. "You'll need to see Madame Pumphrey before the judges give out your score. Over there, she's had to mop up Diggory already." "You did it, Harry," said Hagrid hoarsely. "You did it. And against the horntail and all, and you know Charlie said that was the worst." "Thanks, Hagrid," said Harry loudly, so that Hagrid wouldn't blunder on and reveal that he had shown Harry the dragons beforehand. Professor Moody looked very pleased, too. His magical eye was dancing in its socket. "Nice and easy does the trick, Potter," he growled. "Right then, Potter. The first aid tent, please," said Professor McGonagall. Harry walked out of the enclosure, still panting, and saw Madame Pumphrey standing at the mouth of a second tent, looking worried. "Dragons," she said in a disgusted tone, pulling Harry inside. The tent was divided into cubicles. He could make out Cedric's shadow through the canvas, but Cedric didn't seem to be badly injured. He was sitting up at least. Madame Pumphrey examined Harry's shoulder, talking furiously all the while. "Last year Dementors, this year dragons. What are they going to bring into this school next? You're very lucky. This is quite shallow. It'll need cleaning before I heal it up, though." She cleaned the cut with a dab of some purple liquid that smoked and stung, but then poked his shoulder with her wand, and he felt it heal instantly. "Now just sit quietly for a minute. Sit. And then you can go and get your score." She bustled out of the tent, and he heard her go next door and say, "How does it feel now, Diggory?" Harry didn't want to sit still. He was too full of adrenaline. He got to his feet, wanting to see what was going on outside. But before he'd reached the mouth of the tent, 2 people had come darting inside. Hermione, followed closely by Ron. "Harry, you were brilliant," Hermione said squeakily. There were fingernail marks on her face where she had been clutching it in fear. "You were amazing. You really were." But Harry was looking at Ron, who was very white, and staring at Harry as though he were a ghost. "Harry," he said very seriously, "whoever put your name in that goblet, I reckon they're trying to do you in." It was as though the last few weeks had never happened, as though Harry were meeting Ron for the first time, right after he'd been made champion. "Caught on, have you?" said Harry coldly. "Took you long enough." Hermione stood nervously between them, looking from one to the other. Ron opened his mouth uncertainly. Harry knew Ron was about to apologize, and suddenly he found he didn't need to hear it. "It's okay," he said, before Ron could get the words out. "Forget it." "No," said Ron. "I shouldn't have." "Forget it," Harry said. Ron grinned nervously at him, and Harry grinned back. Hermione burst into tears. "There's nothing to cry about," Harry told her, bewildered. "You two are so stupid," she shouted, stamping her foot on the ground, tears splashing down her front. Then, before either of them could stop her, she had given both of them a hug and dashed away, now positively howling. "Barking mad," said Ron, shaking his head. "Harry, come on. They'll be putting up your scores." Picking up the golden egg and his firebolt, feeling more elated than he would have believed possible an hour ago, Harry ducked out of the tent, Ron by his side, talking fast. "You were the best, you know, no competition. Cedric did this weird thing where he transfigured a rock on the ground, turned it into a dog. He was trying to make the dragon go for the dog instead of him. Well, it was a pretty cool bit of transfiguration, and it sort of worked because he did get the egg, but he got burned as well. The dragon changed its mind halfway through and decided it would rather have him than the Labrador. He only just got away. And that Fleur girl tried this sort of charm. I think she was trying to put it into a trance. Well, that kind of worked too, and went all sleepy, but then it snored, and this great jet of flame shot out, and her skirt caught fire. She put it out with a bit of water out of her wand. And Crumb, he won't believe this, but he didn't even think of flying. He was probably the best after you, though. Hit it with some sort of spell right in the eye. Only thing is, it went trampling around in agony and squashed half the real eggs. They took marks off for that. He wasn't supposed to do any damage to them." Ron drew breath as he and Harry reached the edge of the enclosure. Now that the Wormtail had been taken away, Harry could see where the 5 judges were sitting, right at the other end, in raised seats draped in gold. "It's marks out of 10 from each one," Ron said, and Harry, squinting up the field, saw the first judge, Madame Maxime, raise her wand in the air. What looked like a long silver ribbon shot out of it, which twisted itself into a large figure 8. "Not bad," said Ron as the crowd applauded. "I suppose she took marks off for your shoulder." Mr. Crouch came next. He shot a number 9 into the air. "Looking good," Ron yelled, thumping Harry on the back. Next, Dumbledore. He too put up a 9. The crowd was cheering harder than ever. Ludo Bagman. 10. 10? Said Harry in disbelief. "But I got hurt. What's he playing at?" "Harry, don't complain," Ron yelled excitedly. And now Karkaroff raised his wand. He paused for a moment, and then a number shot out of his wand too. 4. "What?" Ron bellowed furiously. 4? You lousy biased scumbag! You gave Crumb 10! But Harry didn't care. He wouldn't have cared if Karkaroff had given him a 0. Ron's indignation on his behalf was worth about 100 points to him. He didn't tell Ron this, of course, but his heart felt lighter than air as he turned to leave the enclosure. And it wasn't just Ron. Those weren't only Gryffindors cheering in the crowd. When it had come to it, when they had seen what he was facing, most of the school had been on his side as well as Cedric's. He didn't care about the Slytherins. He could stand whatever they threw at him now. "You're tied in first place, Harry, you and Crumb," said Charlie Weasley, hurrying to meet them as they set off back toward the school. "Listen, I've got to run. I've got to go and send Mom an owl. I swore I'd tell her what happened, but that was unbelievable. Oh yeah, and they told me to tell you you've got to hang around for a few more minutes. Bagman wants a word back in the champion's tent." Ron said he would wait, so Harry re-entered the tent, which somehow looked quite different now, friendly and welcoming. He thought back to how he'd felt while dodging the Wormtail, and compared it to the long wait before he'd walked out to face it. There was no comparison. The wait had been immeasurably worse. Fleur, Cedric, and Crumb all came in together. One side of Cedric's face was covered in a thick orange paste, which was presumably mending his burn. He grinned at Harry when he saw him. "Good one, Harry." "And you," said Harry, grinning back. "Well done, all of you," said Ludo Bagman, bouncing into the tent and looking as pleased as though he personally had just got past a dragon. "Now just a few quick words. You've got a nice long break before the second task, which will take place at 9:30 on the morning of February the 24th. But we're giving you something to think about in the meantime. If you look down at those golden eggs you're all holding, you will see that they open. See the hinges there? You need to solve the clue inside the egg, because it will tell you what the second task is, and enable you to prepare for it." All clear? Sure? Well, off you go then. Harry left the tent, rejoined Ron, and they started to walk back around the edge of the forest, talking hard. Harry wanted to hear what the other champions had done in more detail. Then, as they rounded the clump of trees behind which Harry had first heard the dragon's roar, a witch leapt out from behind them. It was Rita Skeeter. She was wearing acid green robes today. The quick-quotes quill in her hand blended perfectly against them. "Congratulations, Harry," she said, beaming at him. "I wonder if you could give me a quick word. How you felt facing that dragon, how you feel now about the fairness of the scoring." "Yeah, you can have a word," said Harry savagely. "Goodbye." And he set off back to the castle with Ron. Chapter 21. The House Elf Liberation Front. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went up to the Owlery that evening to find Pigwidgeon, so that Harry could send Sirius a letter telling him that he had managed to get past his dragon unscathed. On the way, Harry filled Ron in on everything Sirius had told him about Karkaroff. Though shocked at first to hear that Karkaroff had been a Death Eater, by the time they entered the Owlery, Ron was saying that they ought to have suspected it all along. "Fits, doesn't it?" he said. "Remember what Malfoy said on the train about his dad being friends with Karkaroff? Now we know where they know each other. They were probably running around in masks together at the World Cup. I'll tell you one thing, though, Harry. If it was Karkaroff who put your name in the goblet, he's going to be feeling really stupid now, isn't he? Didn't work, did it? You only got a scratch. Come here, I'll do it." Pigwidgeon was so overexcited at the idea of a delivery, he was flying around and around Harry's head, hooting incessantly. Ron snatched Pigwidgeon out of the air and held him still while Harry attached the letter to his leg. "There's no way any of the other tasks are going to be that dangerous. How could they be?" Ron went on as he carried Pigwidgeon to the window. "You know what? I reckon you could win this tournament, Harry. I'm serious." Harry knew that Ron was only saying this to make up for his behavior of the last few weeks, but he appreciated it all the same. Hermione, however, leaned against the Owlery wall, folded her arms, and frowned at Ron. "Harry's got a long way to go before he finishes this tournament," she said seriously. "If that was the first task, I hate to think what's coming next." "Right little ray of sunshine, aren't you?" said Ron. "You and Professor Trelawney should get together sometime." He threw Pigwidgeon out of the window. Pigwidgeon plummeted 12 feet before managing to pull himself back up again. The letter attached to his leg was much longer and heavier than usual. Harry hadn't been able to resist giving Sirius a blow-by-blow account of exactly how he had swerved, circled, and dodged the Horntail. They watched Pigwidgeon disappear into the darkness, and then Ron said, "Well, we'd better get downstairs for your surprise party, Harry. Fred and George should have nicked enough food from the kitchens by now." Sure enough, when they entered the Gryffindor common room, it exploded with cheers and yells again. There were mountains of cakes and flagons of pumpkin juice and butterbeer on every surface. Lee Jordan had let off some filibusters fireworks, so that the air was thick with stars and sparks, and Dean Thomas, who was very good at drawing, had put up some impressive new banners, most of which depicted Harry's zooming around the Horntail's head on his firebolt, though a couple showed Cedric with his head on fire. Harry helped himself to food. He had almost forgotten what it was like to feel properly hungry, and sat down with Ron and Hermione. He couldn't believe how happy he felt. He had Ron back on his side. He'd gotten through the first task, and he wouldn't have to face the second one for 3 months. "Blimey, this is heavy," said Lee Jordan, picking up the golden egg, which Harry had left on a table, and weighing it in his hands. "Open it, Harry, go on. Let's just see what's inside it." "He's supposed to work out the clue on his own," Hermione said swiftly. "It's in the tournament rules." "I was supposed to work out how to get past the dragon on my own, too," Harry muttered, so only Hermione could hear him. And she grinned rather guiltily. Yeah, go on, Harry, open it, several people echoed. Lee passed Harry the egg, and Harry dug his fingernails into the groove that ran all the way around it and prized it open. It was hollow and completely empty. But the moment Harry opened it, the most horrible noise, a loud and screechy wailing, filled the room. The nearest thing to it Harry had ever heard was the ghost orchestra at Nearly Headless Nick's death day party, who had all been playing the musical Saw. "Shut it!" Fred bellowed, his hands over his ears. "What was that?" said Seamus Finnegan, staring at the egg as Harry slammed it shut again. "Sounded like a banshee. Maybe you've got to get past one of those next, Harry." "It was someone being tortured," said Neville, who had gone very white and spilled sausage rolls all over the floor. "You're going to have to fight the Cruciatus curse." "Don't be a prat, Neville, that's illegal," said George. "They wouldn't use the Cruciatus curse on the champions. I thought it sounded a bit like Percy singing. Maybe you've got to attack him while he's in the shower, Harry." "Want a jam tart, Hermione?" said Fred. Hermione looked doubtful at the plate he was offering her. Fred grinned. "It's all right," he said. "I haven't done anything to them. It's the custard creams you've got to watch." Neville, who had just bitten into a custard cream, choked and spat it out. Fred laughed. "Just my little joke, Neville." Hermione took a jam tart. Then she said, "Did you get all this from the kitchens, Fred?" "Yep," said Fred, grinning at her. He put on a high-pitched squeak and imitated the house elf. "Anything we can get you, sir. Anything at all. They're dead helpful. Get me a roast ox if I said I was peckish." "How do you get in there?" Hermione said in an innocently casual sort of voice. "Easy," said Fred. "Concealed door behind a painting of a bowl of fruit. Just tickle the pear, and it giggles and—" He stopped and looked suspiciously at her. "Why?" "Nothing," said Hermione quickly. "Going to try and lead the house elves out on strike now, are you?" said George. "Going to give up all the leaflet stuff and try to stir them up into rebellion?" Several people chortled. Hermione didn't answer. "Don't you go upsetting them and telling them they've got to take clothes and salaries," said Fred warningly. "You'll put them off their cooking." Just then, Neville caused a slight diversion by turning into a large canary. "Oh, sorry, Neville," Fred shouted over all the laughter. "I forgot. It was the custard creams we hexed." Within a minute, however, Neville had molted, and once his feathers had fallen off, he reappeared looking entirely normal. He even joined in laughing. "Canary creams," Fred shouted to the excitable crowd. "George and I invented them. 7 sickles each, a bargain." It was nearly 1 a.m. when Harry finally went up to the dormitory with Ron, Neville, Seamus, and Dean. Before he pulled the curtains of his 4-poster shut, Harry set his tiny model of the Hungarian wormtail on the table next to his bed, where it yawned, curled up, and closed its eyes. Really, Harry thought as he pulled the hangings on his 4-poster closed, Hagrid had a point. They were all right, really, dragons. The start of December brought wind and sleet to Hogwarts. Drafty though the castle always was in winter, Harry was glad of its fires and thick walls every time he passed the Durmstrang ship on the lake, which was pitching in the high winds, its black sails billowing against the dark skies. He thought the Beaubaton caravan was likely to be pretty chilly, too. Hagrid, he noticed, was keeping Madame Maxime's horses well provided with their preferred drink of single malt whiskey. The fumes wafting from the trough in the corner of their paddock was enough to make the entire Care of Magical Creatures class lightheaded. This was unhelpful, as they were still tending the horrible Scroots and needed their wits about them. "I'm not sure whether they hibernate or not," Hagrid told the shivering class in the windy pumpkin patch next lesson. "Thought we'd just try and see if they fancied a kip. We'll just settle 'em down in these boxes." There were now only 10 Scroots left. Apparently, their desire to kill one another had not been exorcised out of them. Each of them was now approaching 6 feet in length. Their thick gray armor, their powerful scuttling legs, their fire-blasting ends, their stings, and their suckers combined to make the Scroots the most repulsive things Harry had ever seen. The class looked dispiritedly at the enormous boxes Hagrid had brought out, all lined with pillows and fluffy blankets. "We'll just lead 'em in here," Hagrid said, "and put the lids on, and we'll see what happens." But the Scroots, it transpired, did not hibernate, and did not appreciate being forced into pillow-lined boxes and nailed in. Hagrid was soon yelling, "Don't panic now, don't panic," while the Scroots rampaged around the pumpkin patch, now strewn with the smoldering wreckage of the boxes. Most of the class, Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle in the lead, had fled into Hagrid's cabin through the back door and barricaded themselves in. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were among those who remained outside trying to help Hagrid. Together, they managed to restrain and tie up 9 of the Scroots, though at the cost of numerous burns and cuts. Finally, only 1 Scroot was left. "Don't frighten him now," Hagrid shouted as Ron and Harry used their wands to shoot jets of fiery sparks at the Scroot, which was advancing menacingly on them, its sting arched, quivering over its back. "Just try and slip the rope round his sting so he won't hurt any of the others." "Yeah, we wouldn't want that," Ron shouted angrily as he and Harry backed into the wall of Hagrid's cabin, still holding the Scroot off with their sparks. Well, this does look like fun." Rita Skeeter was leaning on Hagrid's garden fence, looking in at the mayhem. She was wearing a thick magenta cloak with a furry purple collar today, and her crocodile skin handbag was over her arm. Hagrid launched himself forward on top of the Scroot that was cornering Harry and Ron, and flattened it. A blast of fire shot out of its end, withering the pumpkin plants nearby. "Who are you?" Hagrid asked Rita Skeeter as he slipped a loop of rope around the Scroot's sting and tightened it. "Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet reporter," Rita replied, beaming at him. Her gold teeth glinted. "Thought Dumbledore said you weren't allowed inside the school anymore," said Hagrid, frowning slightly as he got off the slightly squashed Scroot and started tugging it over to its fellows. Rita acted as though she hadn't heard what Hagrid had said. "What are these fascinating creatures called?" she asked, beaming still more widely. "Blast-ended Scroots," grunted Hagrid. "Really?" said Rita, apparently full of lively interest. "I've never heard of them before. Where do they come from?" Harry noticed a dull red flush rising up out of Hagrid's wild black beard, and his heart sank. Where had Hagrid got the Scroots from? Hermione, who seemed to be thinking along these lines, said quickly, "They're very interesting, aren't they? Aren't they, Harry?" "What? Oh yeah, ouch. Interesting," said Harry as she stepped on his foot. "Ah, you're here, Harry," said Rita Skeeter as she looked around. "So you like care of magical creatures, do you? One of your favorite lessons?" "Yes," said Harry stoutly. Hagrid beamed at him. "Lovely," said Rita, "really lovely. Been teaching long?" she added to Hagrid. Harry noticed her eyes travel over Dean, who had a nasty cut across one cheek, Lavender, whose robes were badly singed, Seamus, who was nursing several burnt fingers, and then to the cabin windows, where most of the class stood, their noses pressed against the glass, waiting to see if the coast was clear. "This is only me 2nd year," said Hagrid. "Lovely. I don't suppose you'd like to give an interview, would you? Share some of your experience of magical creatures? The prophet does a zoological column every Wednesday, as I'm sure you know. We could feature these, bang-ended scoots." "Blast-ended scroots," Hagrid said eagerly. Yeah, why not?" Harry had a very bad feeling about this, but there was no way of communicating it to Hagrid without Rita Skeeter seeing, so he had to stand and watch in silence as Hagrid and Rita Skeeter made arrangements to meet in the Three Broomsticks for a good long interview later that week. Then the bell rang up at the castle, signaling the end of the lesson. "Well, goodbye, Harry," Rita Skeeter called merrily to him as he set off with Ron and Hermione. "Until Friday night, then, Hagrid." "She'll twist everything he says," Harry said under his breath. "Just as long as he didn't import those scroots illegally or anything," said Hermione desperately. They looked at one another. It was exactly the sort of thing Hagrid might do. "Hagrid's been in loads of trouble before, and Dumbledore's never sacked him," said Ron consolingly. "Worst that can happen is Hagrid'll have to get rid of the scroots." "Sorry, did I say worst? I meant best." Harry and Hermione laughed, and, feeling slightly more cheerful, went off to lunch. Harry thoroughly enjoyed double divination that afternoon. They were still doing star charts and predictions, but now that he and Ron were friends once more, the whole thing seemed very funny again. Professor Trelawney, who had been so pleased with the pair of them when they had been predicting their own horrific deaths, quickly became irritated as they sniggered through her explanation of the various ways in which Pluto could disrupt everyday life. "I would think," she said in a mystical whisper that did not conceal her obvious annoyance, "that some of us," she stared very meaningfully at Harry, "might be a little less frivolous had they seen what I have seen during my crystal gazing last night. As I sat here absorbed in my needlework, the urge to consult the orb overpowered me. I arose, I settled myself before it, and I gazed into its crystalline depths. And what do you think I saw gazing back at me? An ugly old bat in outsized specs?" Ron muttered under his breath. Harry fought hard to keep his face straight. "Death, my dears." Parvati and Lavender both put their hands over their mouths, looking horrified. "Yes," said Professor Trelawney, nodding impressively. "It comes ever closer. It circles overhead like a vulture, ever lower over the castle." She stared pointedly at Harry, who yawned very widely and obviously. "It'd be a bit more impressive if she hadn't done it about 80 times before," Harry said as they finally regained the fresh air of the staircase beneath Professor Trelawney's room. "But if I drop dead every time she's told me I'm going to, I'd be a medical miracle." "You'd be a sort of extra-concentrated ghost," said Ron, chortling, as they passed the bloody Baron going in the opposite direction, his wide eyes staring sinisterly. "At least we didn't get homework. I hope Hermione got loads off Professor Vector. I love not working when she is." But Hermione wasn't at dinner, nor was she in the library when they went to look for her afterward. The only person in there was Victor Crumb. Ron hovered behind the bookshelves for a while, watching Crumb, debating in whispers with Harry whether he should ask for an autograph. But then Ron realized that 6 or 7 girls were lurking in the next row of books, debating exactly the same thing, and he lost his enthusiasm for the idea. "Wonder where she's got to," Ron said as he and Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower. "Dunno, Boulderdash." But the fat lady had barely begun to swing forward when the sound of racing feet behind them announced Hermione's arrival. "Harry!" she panted, skidding to a halt beside him. The fat lady stared down at her, eyebrows raised. "Harry, you've got to come. You've got to come. The most amazing things happened. Please." She seized Harry's arm and started trying to drag him back along the corridor. "What's the matter?" Harry said. "I'll show you when we get there. Oh, come on, quick." Harry looked around at Ron. He looked back at Harry, intrigued. "Okay," Harry said, starting off back down the corridor with Hermione, Ron hurrying to keep up. "Oh, don't mind me," the fat lady called irritably after them. "Don't apologize for bothering me. I'll just hang here wide open until you get back, shall I?" "Yeah, thanks," Ron shouted over his shoulder. "Hermione, where are we going?" Harry asked, after she had led them down through 6 floors and started down the marble staircase into the entrance hall. You'll see in a minute," said Hermione excitedly. She turned left at the bottom of the staircase and hurried toward the door through which Cedric Diggory had gone the night after the Goblet of Fire had regurgitated his and Harry's names. Harry had never been through here before. He and Ron followed Hermione down a flight of stone steps, but instead of ending up in a gloomy underground passage like the one that led to Snape's dungeon, they found themselves in a broad stone corridor, brightly lit with torches and decorated with cheerful paintings that were mainly of food. "Oh, hang on," said Harry slowly, halfway down the corridor. "Wait a minute, Hermione." "What?" She turned around to look at him, anticipation all over her face. "I know what this is about," said Harry. He nudged Ron and pointed to the painting just behind Hermione. It showed a gigantic silver fruit bowl. "Hermione," said Ron, cottoning on, "you're trying to rope us into that spew stuff again." No, I'm not," she said hastily. "And it's not spew, Ron." "Changed the name, have you?" said Ron, frowning at her. "What are we now, then? The House Elf Liberation Front?" "I'm not barging into that kitchen and trying to make them stop work. I'm not doing it. I'm not asking you to," Hermione said impatiently. "I came down here just now to talk to them all, and I found— Oh, come on, Harry, I want to show you." She seized his arm again, pulled him in front of the picture of the giant fruit bowl, stretched out her forefinger, and tickled the huge green pear. It began to squirm, chuckling, and suddenly turned into a large green door handle. Hermione seized it, pulled the door open, and pushed Harry hard in the back, forcing him inside. He had one brief glimpse of an enormous high-ceilinged room, large as the great hall above it, with mounds of glittering brass pots and pans heaped around the stone walls, and a great brick fireplace at the other end, when something small hurtled toward him from the middle of the room, squealing, "Harry Potter, sir! Harry Potter!" Next second all the wind had been knocked out of him as the squealing elf hit him hard in the midriff, hugging him so tightly he thought his ribs would break. "Dobby?" Harry gasped. "It is Dobby, sir, it is," squealed the voice from somewhere around his navel. "Dobby has been hoping and hoping to see Harry Potter, sir, and Harry Potter has come to see him, sir." Dobby let go and stepped back a few paces, beaming up at Harry, his enormous green tennis ball-shaped eyes brimming with tears of happiness. He looked almost exactly as Harry remembered him. The pencil-shaped nose, the bat-like ears, the long fingers and feet. All except the clothes, which were very different. When Dobby had worked for the Malfoys, he had always worn the same filthy old pillowcase. Now, however, he was wearing the strangest assortment of garments Harry had ever seen. He had done an even worse job of dressing himself than the wizards at the World Cup. He was wearing a tea cozy for a hat, on which he had pinned a number of bright badges, a tie patterned with horseshoes over a bare chest, a pair of what looked like children's soccer shorts, and odd socks. One of these, Harry saw, was the black one Harry had removed from his own foot and tricked Mr. Malfoy into giving Dobby, thereby setting Dobby free. The other was covered in pink and orange stripes. "Dobby, what are you doing here?" Harry said in amazement. "Dobby has come to work at Hogwarts, sir," Dobby squealed excitedly. "Professor Dumbledore gave Dobby and Winky jobs, sir." "Winky?" said Harry. "She's here too?" "Yes, sir, yes," said Dobby, and he seized Harry's hand and pulled him off into the kitchen between the 4 long wooden tables that stood there. Each of these tables, Harry noticed as he passed them, was positioned exactly beneath the 4 house tables above in the great hall. At the moment, they were clear of food, dinner having finished, but he supposed that an hour ago they had been laden with dishes that were then sent up through the ceiling to their counterparts above. At least 100 little elves were standing around the kitchen, beaming, bowing, and curtsying as Dobby led Harry past them. They were all wearing the same uniform, a tea towel stamped with the Hogwarts crest, and tied, as Winky's had been, like a toga. Dobby stopped in front of the brick fireplace and pointed. "Winky, sir," he said. Winky was sitting on a stool by the fire. Unlike Dobby, she had obviously not foraged for clothes. She was wearing a neat little skirt and blouse with a matching blue hat, which had holes in it for her large ears. However, while every one of Dobby's strange collection of garments was so clean and well cared for that it looked brand new, Winky was plainly not taking care of her clothes at all. There were soup stains all down her blouse and a burn in her skirt. "Hello, Winky," said Harry. Winky's lip quivered. Then she burst into tears, which spilled out of her great brown eyes and splashed down her front, just as they had done at the Quidditch World Cup. "Oh dear," said Hermione. She and Ron had followed Harry and Dobby to the end of the kitchen. "Winky, don't cry, please don't." But Winky cried harder than ever. Dobby, on the other hand, beamed up at Harry. "Would Harry Potter like a cup of tea?" he squeaked loudly over Winky's sobs. Yeah, okay," said Harry. Instantly, about 6 house elves came trotting up behind him, bearing a large silver tray laden with a teapot, cups for Harry, Ron, and Hermione, a milk jug, and a large plate of biscuits. "Good service," Ron said in an impressed voice. Hermione frowned at him, but the elves all looked delighted. They bowed very low and retreated. "How long have you been here, Dobby?" Harry asked as Dobby handed around the tea. "Only a week, Harry Potter, sir," said Dobby happily. "Dobby came to see Professor Dumbledore, sir. You see, sir, it is very difficult for a house elf who has been dismissed to get a new position, sir. Very difficult indeed." At this, Winky howled even harder, her squashed tomato of a nose dribbling all down her front, though she made no effort to stem the flow. "Dobby has traveled the country for 2 whole years, sir, trying to find work," Dobby squeaked. "But Dobby hasn't found work, sir, because Dobby wants paying now." The house elves all around the kitchen, who had been listening and watching with interest, all looked away at these words, as though Dobby had said something rude and embarrassing. Hermione, however, said, "Good for you, Dobby." "Thank you, miss," said Dobby, grinning toothily at her. "But most wizards doesn't want a house elf who wants paying, miss. That's not the point of a house elf, they says, and they slammed the door in Dobby's face. Dobby likes work, but he wants to wear clothes and he wants to be paid, Harry Potter. Dobby likes being free." The Hogwarts house elves had now started edging away from Dobby, as though he were carrying something contagious. Winky, however, remained where she was, though there was a definite increase in the volume of her crying. "And then, Harry Potter, Dobby goes to visit Winky, and finds out Winky has been freed too, sir," said Dobby delightedly. At this, Winky flung herself forward off her stool and lay face down on the flagged stone floor, beating her tiny fists upon it and positively screaming with misery. Hermione hastily dropped down to her knees beside her and tried to comfort her, but nothing she said made the slightest difference. Dobby continued with his story, shouting shrilly over Winky's screeches. "And then Dobby had the idea, Harry Potter, sir. 'Why doesn't Dobby and Winky find work together?' Dobby says. 'Where is there enough work for 2 house elves?' says Winky. And Dobby thinks, and it comes to him, sir, Hogwarts. So Dobby and Winky came to see Professor Dumbledore, sir, and Professor Dumbledore took us on." Dobby beamed very brightly, and happy tears welled in his eyes again. "And Professor Dumbledore says he will pay Dobby, sir, if Dobby wants paying. And so Dobby is a free elf, sir, and Dobby gets a galleon a week and 1 day off a month." "That's not very much," Hermione shouted indignantly from the floor over Winky's continued screaming and fist-beating. "Professor Dumbledore offered Dobby 10 galleons a week and weekends off," said Dobby, suddenly giving a little shiver, as though the prospect of so much leisure and riches were frightening. "But Dobby beat him down, miss. Dobby likes freedom, miss, but he isn't wanting too much, miss. He likes work better." "And how much is Professor Dumbledore paying you, Winky?" Hermione asked kindly. If she had thought this would cheer up Winky, she was wildly mistaken. Winky did stop crying, but when she sat up she was glaring at Hermione through her massive brown eyes, her whole face sopping wet and suddenly furious. "Winky is a disgraced elf, but Winky is not yet getting paid," she squeaked. "Winky is not sunk so low as that. Winky is properly ashamed of being freed." "Ashamed?" said Hermione blankly. "But, Winky, come on. It's Mr. Crouch who should be ashamed, not you. You didn't do anything wrong. He was really horrible to you." But at these words, Winky clapped her hands over the holes in her hat, flattening her ears so that she couldn't hear a word, and screeched, "You is not insulting my master, miss. You is not insulting Mr. Crouch. Mr. Crouch is a good wizard, miss. Mr. Crouch is right to sack bad Winky." "Winky is having trouble adjusting, Harry Potter," squeaked Dobby confidentially. "Winky forgets she is not bound to Mr. Crouch anymore. She is allowed to speak her mind now, but she won't do it." "Can't house elves speak their minds about their masters, then?" Harry asked. "Oh, no, sir, no," said Dobby, looking suddenly serious. "'Tis part of the house elf's enslavement, sir. We keeps their secrets and our silence, sir. We upholds the family's honor, and we never speaks ill of them. Though Professor Dumbledore told Dobby he does not insist upon this. Professor Dumbledore said we is free to... Dobby looked suddenly nervous and beckoned Harry closer. Harry bent forward. Dobby whispered, "He said we is free to call him a barmy old conjure if we like, sir." Dobby gave a frightened sort of giggle. "But Dobby is not wanting to, Harry Potter," he said, talking normally again and shaking his head so that his ears flapped. "Dobby likes Professor Dumbledore very much, sir, and is proud to keep his secrets and our silence for him." "But you can say what you like about the Malfoys now?" Harry asked him, grinning. A slightly fearful look came into Dobby's immense eyes. Dobby could," he said doubtfully. He squared his small shoulders. "Dobby could tell Harry Potter that his old masters were bad, dark wizards." Dobby stood for a moment, quivering all over, horror-struck by his own daring. Then he rushed over to the nearest table and began banging his head on it very hard, squealing, "Bad Dobby, bad Dobby!" Harry seized Dobby by the back of his tie and pulled him away from the table. "Thank you, Harry Potter, thank you," said Dobby breathlessly, rubbing his head. "You just need a bit of practice," Harry said. "Practice?" squealed Winky furiously. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Dobby, talking that way about your masters." "They isn't my masters any more, Winky," said Dobby defiantly. "Dobby doesn't care what they think any more." "Oh, you is a bad elf, Dobby," moaned Winky, tears leaking down her face once more. "My poor Mr. Crouch. What is he doing without Winky? He is needing me. He's needing my help. I is looking after the Crouches all my life, and my mother is doing it before me, and my grandmother is doing it before her. Oh, what is they saying if they knew Winky was afraid? Oh, the shame, the shame!" She buried her face in her skirt again and bawled. "Winky," said Hermione firmly, I'm quite sure Mr. Crouch is getting along perfectly well without you. We've seen him, you know." "You is seeing my master?" said Winky breathlessly, raising her tear-stained face out of her skirt once more and goggling at Hermione. "You is seeing him here at Hogwarts?" "Yes," said Hermione. "He and Mr. Bagman are judges in the Triwizard Tournament." "Mr. Bagman comes too?" squeaked Winky, and to Harry's great surprise, and Ron's and Hermione's too by the looks on their faces, she looked angry again. "Mr. Bagman is a bad wizard, a very bad wizard. My master isn't liking him. Oh, no, not at all." "Bagman? Bad?" said Harry. "Whoa, yes," Winky said, nodding her head furiously. "My master is telling Winky some things, but Winky is not saying. Winky keeps her master's secrets." She dissolved yet again in tears. They could hear her sobbing into her skirt. "Poor master, no Winky to help him no more." They couldn't get another sensible word out of Winky. They left her to her crying and finished their tea, while Dobby chatted happily about his life as a free elf and his plans for his wages. "Dobby is going to buy a sweater next, Harry Potter," he said happily, pointing at his bare chest. "Tell you what, Dobby," said Ron, who seemed to have taken a great liking to the elf. "I'll give you the one my mum knits me this Christmas. I always get one from her. You don't mind maroon, do you?" Dobby was delighted. "We might have to shrink it a bit to fit you," Ron told him, "but it'll go well with your tea cozy." As they prepared to take their leave, many of the surrounding elves pressed in upon them, offering snacks to take back upstairs. Hermione refused, with a pained look at the way the elves kept bowing and curtsying, but Harry and Ron loaded their pockets with cream cakes and pies. "Thanks a lot," Harry said to the elves, who had all clustered around the door to say goodnight. "See you, Dobby." "Harry Potter? Can Dobby come and see you sometimes, sir?" Dobby asked tentatively. "Course you can," said Harry, and Dobby beamed. "You know what?" said Ron once he, Hermione, and Harry had left the kitchens behind and were climbing the steps into the entrance hall again. "All these years I've been really impressed with Fred and George, nicking food from the kitchens. Well, it's not exactly difficult, is it? They can't wait to give it away." "I think this is the best thing that could have happened to those elves, you know," said Hermione, leading the way back up the marble staircase. "Dobby coming to work here, I mean. The other elves will see how happy he is being free, and slowly it'll dawn on them that they want that too." "Let's hope they don't look too closely at Winky," said Harry. "Oh, she'll cheer up," said Hermione, though she sounded a bit doubtful. "Once the shock's worn off and she's got used to Hogwarts, she'll see how much better off she is without that Crouch man." "She seems to love him," said Ron thickly. He had just started on a cream cake. "Doesn't think much of Bagman, though, does she?" said Harry. "Wonder what Crouch says at home about him." "Probably says he's not a very good head of department," says Hermione. "And let's face it, he's got a point, hasn't he?" "I'd still rather work for him than old Crouch," said Ron. "At least Bagman's got a sense of humor." "Don't let Percy hear you saying that," Hermione said, smiling slightly. "Yeah, well, Percy wouldn't want to work for anyone with a sense of humor, would he?" said Ron, now starting on a chocolate eclair. "Percy wouldn't recognize a joke if it danced naked in front of him wearing Dobby's tea cozy." Chapter 22. The Unexpected Task. "Potter, Weasley, will you pay attention?" Professor McGonagall's irritated voice cracked like a whip through the Transfiguration class on Thursday, and Harry and Ron both jumped and looked up. It was the end of the lesson. They had finished their work. The guinea fowl they had been changing into guinea pigs had been shut away in a large cage on Professor McGonagall's desk. Neville's still had feathers. They had copied down their homework from the blackboard. Describe, with examples, the ways in which transforming spells must be adapted when performing cross-species switches. The bell was due to ring at any moment, and Harry and Ron, who had been having a sword fight with a couple of Fred and George's fake wands at the back of the class, looked up, Ron holding a tin parrot and Harry a rubber haddock. "Now that Potter and Weasley have been kind enough to act their age," said Professor McGonagall with an angry look at the pair of them, as the head of Harry's haddock drooped and fell silently to the floor. Ron's parrot's beak had severed it moments before. "I have something to say to you all. The Yule Ball is approaching, a traditional part of the Triwizard Tournament, and an opportunity for us to socialize with our foreign guests. Now the ball will be open only to 4th years and above, although you may invite a younger student if you wish." Lavender Brown let out a shrill giggle. Parvati Patel nudged her hard in the ribs, her face working furiously, as she too fought not to giggle. They both looked around at Harry. Professor McGonagall ignored them, which Harry thought was distinctly unfair, as she had just told off him and Ron. "Dress robes will be worn," Professor McGonagall continued, "and the ball will start at 8 o'clock on Christmas Day, finishing at midnight in the Great Hall. Now then." Professor McGonagall stared deliberately around the class. "The Yule Ball is, of course, a chance for us all to, let our hair down," she said in a disapproving voice. Lavender giggled harder than ever, with her hand pressed hard against her mouth to stifle the sound. Harry could see what was funny this time. Professor McGonagall, with her hair in a tight bun, looked as though she had never let her hair down in any sense. "But that does not mean," Professor McGonagall went on, "that we will be relaxing the standards of behavior we expect from Hogwarts students. I will be most seriously displeased if a Gryffindor student embarrasses the school in any way." The bell rang, and there was the usual scuffle of activity as everyone packed their bags and swung them onto their shoulders. Professor McGonagall called above the noise, "Potter, a word, if you please." Assuming this had something to do with his headless rubber haddock, Harry proceeded gloomily to the teacher's desk. Professor McGonagall waited until the rest of the class had gone, and then said, "Potter, the champions and their partners—" "What partners?" said Harry. Professor McGonagall looked suspiciously at him, as though she thought he was trying to be funny. "Your partners for the Yule Ball, Potter," she said coldly. "Your dance partners." Harry's insides seemed to curl up and shrivel. "Dance partners?" He felt himself going red. "I don't dance," he said quickly. "Oh, yes, you do," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "That's what I'm telling you. Traditionally, the champions and their partners open the ball." Harry had a sudden mental image of himself in a top hat and tails, accompanied by a girl in the sort of frilly dress Aunt Petunia always wore to Uncle Vernon's work parties. "I'm not dancing," he said. "It is traditional," said Professor McGonagall firmly. "You are a Hogwarts champion, and you will do what is expected of you as a representative of the school, so make sure you get yourself a partner, Potter." "But I don't—" "You heard me, Potter," said Professor McGonagall in a very final sort of way. A week ago, Harry would have said finding a partner for a dance would be a cinch compared to taking on a Hungarian wormtail. But now that he had done the latter, and was facing the prospect of asking a girl to the ball, he thought he'd rather have another round with the dragon. Harry had never known so many people to put their names down to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas. He always did, of course, because the alternative was usually going back to Privet Drive. But he had always been very much in the minority before now. This year, however, everyone in the 4th year and above seemed to be staying, and they all seemed to Harry to be obsessed with the coming ball. Or at least all the girls were, and it was amazing how many girls Hogwarts suddenly seemed to hold. He had never quite noticed that before. Girls giggling and whispering in the corridors, girls shrieking with laughter as boys passed them, girls excitedly comparing notes on what they were going to wear on Christmas night. "Why do they have to move in packs?" Harry asked Ron as a dozen or so girls walked past them, sniggering and staring at Harry. "How are you supposed to get one on their own to ask them?" "Lasso one?" Ron suggested. "Got any idea who you're going to try?" Harry didn't answer. He knew perfectly well whom he'd like to ask, but working up the nerve was something else. Cho was a year older than he was. She was very pretty. She was a very good Quidditch player, and she was also very popular. Ron seemed to know what was going on inside Harry's head. "Listen, you're not going to have any trouble. You're a champion. You've just beaten a Hungarian wormtail. I bet they'll be queuing up to go with you." In tribute to their recently repaired friendship, Ron had kept the bitterness in his voice to a bare minimum. Moreover, to Harry's amazement, he turned out to be quite right. A curly-haired third-year Hufflepuff girl, to whom Harry had never spoken in his life, asked him to go to the ball with her the very next day. Harry was so taken aback, he said no before he'd even stopped to consider the matter. The girl walked off looking rather hurt, and Harry had to endure Dean's, Seamus's, and Ron's taunts about her all through History of Magic. The following day, 2 more girls asked him, a second year and, to his horror, a 5th year, who looked as though she might knock him out if he refused. "She was quite good-looking," said Ron fairly after he'd stopped laughing. "She was a foot taller than me," said Harry, still unnerved. Imagine what I'd look like trying to dance with her. Hermione's words about Crumb kept coming back to him. "They only like him because he's famous." Harry doubted very much if any of the girls would ask to be his partner so far would have wanted to go to the ball with him if he hadn't been a school champion. Then he wondered if this would bother him if Cho asked him. On the whole, Harry had to admit that even with the embarrassing prospect of opening the ball before him, life had definitely improved since he had got through the first task. He wasn't attracting nearly as much unpleasantness in the corridors anymore, which he suspected had a lot to do with Cedric. He had an idea Cedric might have told the Hufflepuffs to leave Harry alone, in gratitude for Harry's tip-off about the dragons. There seemed to be fewer Support Cedric Diggory badges around, too. Draco Malfoy, of course, was still quoting Rita Skeeter's article to him at every possible opportunity, but he was getting fewer and fewer laughs out of it. And just to heighten Harry's feeling of well-being, no story about Hagrid had appeared in the Daily Prophet. "She didn't seem very interested in magical creatures, to tell you the truth," Hagrid said when Harry, Ron, and Hermione asked him how his interview with Rita Skeeter had gone during the last Care of Magical Creatures lesson of the term. To their very great relief, Hagrid had given up on direct contact with the Scroots now, and they were merely sheltering behind his cabin today, sitting at a trestle table and preparing a fresh selection of food with which to tempt the Scroots. "She just wanted me to talk about you, Harry," Hagrid continued in a low voice. "Well, I told her we'd been friends since I went to fetch you from the Dursleys." "Never had to tell him off in 4 years," she said. "Never played you up in lessons, has he?" I told her no, and she didn't seem happy at all. You'd think she wanted me to say you were horrible, Harry. "Course she did," said Harry, throwing lumps of dragon liver into a large metal bowl and picking up his knife to cut some more. "She can't keep writing about what a tragic little hero I am. It'll get boring." "She wants a new angle, Hagrid," said Ron wisely as he shelled salamander eggs. "You were supposed to say Harry's a mad delinquent." "But he's not," said Hagrid, looking genuinely shocked. "She should have interviewed Snape," said Harry grimly. "He'd give her the goods on me any day. Potter has been crossing lines ever since he first arrived at this school." "Said that, did he?" said Hagrid, while Ron and Hermione laughed. "Well, you might have bent a few rules, Harry, but you're all right really, aren't you?" "Cheers, Hagrid," said Harry, grinning. "You coming to this ball thing on Christmas Day, Hagrid?" said Ron. "Thought I might look in on it, yeah," said Hagrid gruffly. "Should be a good do, I reckon. You'll be opening the dancing, will you, Harry? Who are you taking?" "No one yet," said Harry, feeling himself going red again. Hagrid didn't pursue the subject. The last week of term became increasingly boisterous as it progressed. Rumors about the Yule Ball were flying everywhere, though Harry didn't believe half of them. For instance, that Dumbledore had bought 800 barrels of mulled mead from Madame Rosemerta. It seemed to be fact, however, that he had booked the Weird Sisters. Exactly who or what the Weird Sisters were, Harry didn't know, having never had access to a wizard's wireless. But he deduced from the wild excitement of those who had grown up listening to the WWN, Wizarding Wireless Network, that they were a very famous musical group. Some of the teachers, like little Professor Flitwick, gave up trying to teach them much when their minds were so clearly elsewhere. He allowed them to play games in his lesson on Wednesday, and spent most of it talking to Harry about the perfect summoning charm Harry had used during the first task of the Triwizard Tournament. Other teachers were not so generous. Nothing would ever deflect Professor Binns, for example, from plowing on through his notes on goblin rebellions. As Binns hadn't let his own death stand in the way of continuing to teach, they supposed a small thing like Christmas wasn't going to put him off. It was amazing how he could make even bloody and vicious goblin riots sound as boring as Percy's Cauldron Bottom report. Professors McGonagall and Moody kept them working until the very last second of their classes too, and Snape, of course, would no sooner let them play games in class than adopt Harry. Staring nastily around at them all, he informed them that he would be testing them on poison antidotes during the last lesson of the term. "Evil he is," Ron said bitterly that night in the Gryffindor common room, "springing a test on us on the last day. Ruining the last bit of term with a whole load of studying." You're not exactly straining yourself, though, are you?" said Hermione, looking at him over the top of her potions notes. Ron was busy building a card castle out of his exploding snap pack, a much more interesting pastime than with Muggle cards, because of the chance that the whole thing would blow up at any second. "It's Christmas, Hermione," said Harry lazily. He was rereading Flying with the Cannons for the 10th time in an armchair near the fire. Hermione looked severely over at him, too. "I'd have thought you'd be doing something constructive, Harry, even if you don't want to learn your antidotes." "Like what?" Harry said, as he watched Joey Jenkins of the Cannons belt a bludger toward a Ballycastle bat's chaser. "That egg!" Hermione hissed. "Come on, Hermione. I've got till February the 24th, Harry said. He had put the golden egg upstairs in his trunk and hadn't opened it since the celebration party after the first task. There were still 2.5 months to go until he needed to know what all this screechy wailing meant, after all. "But it might take weeks to work it out," said Hermione. "You're going to look a real idiot if everyone else knows what the next task is and you don't." "Leave him alone, Hermione. He's earned a bit of a break," said Ron, and he placed the last 2 cards on top of the castle, and the whole lot blew up, singeing his eyebrows. "Nice luck, Ron. Go well with your dress robes, that will." It was Fred and George. They sat down at the table with Harry, Ron, and Hermione, as Ron felt how much damage had been done. "Ron, can we borrow Pigwidgeon?" George asked. "No, he's off delivering a letter," said Ron. "Why?" "Because George wants to invite him to the ball," said Fred sarcastically. "Because we want to send a letter, you stupid great prat," said George. "Who do you two keep writing to, eh?" said Ron. "Nose out, Ron, or I'll burn that for you too," said Fred, waving his wand threateningly. "So, you lot got dates for the ball yet?" "Nope," said Ron. "Well, you better hurry up, mate, or all the good ones will be gone," said Fred. Who are you going with then? Said Ron. Angelina, said Fred promptly, without a trace of embarrassment. What? Said Ron, taken aback. You've already asked her? Good point, said Fred. He turned his head and called across the common room. Oi, Angelina! Angelina, who had been chatting with Alicia Spinnet near the fire, looked over at him. What? She called back. Want to come to the ball with me? Angelina gave Fred an appraising sort of look. All right then, she said, and she turned back to Alicia and carried on chatting with a bit of a grin on her face. There you go, said Fred to Harry and Ron. Piece of cake. He got to his feet, yawning, and said, We'd better use a school owl then, George. Come on. They left. Ron stopped feeling his eyebrows and looked across the smoldering wreck of his card castle at Harry. We should get a move on, you know. Ask someone. He's right. We don't want to end up with a pair of fools. Hermione let out a sputter of indignation. A pair of... What? Excuse me? Well, you know, said Ron, shrugging. I'd rather go alone than with Eloise Midgen, say. Her acne's loads better lately, and she's really nice. Her nose is off-center, said Ron. Oh, I see, Hermione said, bristling. So basically, you're going to take the best-looking girl who'll have you, even if she's completely horrible? Yeah, that sounds about right, said Ron. I'm going to bed, Hermione snapped, and she swept off toward the girls' staircase without another word. The Hogwarts staff, demonstrating a continued desire to impress the visitors from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, seemed determined to show the castle at its best this Christmas. When the decorations went up, Harry noticed that they were the most stunning he had yet seen inside the school. Everlasting icicles had been attached to the banisters of the marble staircase. The usual 12 Christmas trees in the Great Hall were bedecked with everything from luminous holly berries to real hooting golden owls, and the suits of armor had all been bewitched to sing carols whenever anyone passed them. It was quite something to hear "O Come All Ye Faithful" sung by an empty helmet that only knew half the words. Several times, Filch the caretaker had to extract Peeves from inside the armor, where he had taken to hiding, filling in the gaps in the songs with lyrics of his own invention, all of which were very rude. And still, Harry hadn't asked Cho to the ball. He and Ron were getting very nervous now, though as Harry pointed out, Ron would look much less stupid than he would without a partner. Harry was supposed to be starting the dancing with the other champions. I suppose there's always Moaning Myrtle, he said gloomily, referring to the ghost who haunted the girls' toilets on the second floor. Harry, we've just got to grit our teeth and do it, said Ron on Friday morning, in a tone that suggested they were planning the storming of an impregnable fortress. When we get back to the common room tonight, we'll both have partners. Agreed? Okay, said Harry. But every time he glimpsed Cho that day, during break and then lunchtime, and once on the way to History of Magic, she was surrounded by friends. Didn't she ever go anywhere alone? Could he perhaps ambush her as she was going into a bathroom? But no, she even seemed to go there with an escort of 4 or 5 girls. Yet if he didn't do it soon, she was bound to have been asked by somebody else. He found it hard to concentrate on Snape's potions test, and consequently forgot to add the key ingredient, a Bezoar, meaning that he received bottom marks. He didn't care, though. He was too busy screwing up his courage for what he was about to do. When the bell rang, he grabbed his bag and hurried to the dungeon door. I'll meet you at dinner, he said to Ron and Hermione, and he dashed off upstairs. He'd just have to ask Cho for a private word, that was all. He hurried off through the packed corridors looking for her, and, rather sooner than he had expected, he found her, emerging from a Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. Cho? Could I have a word with you? Giggling should be made illegal, Harry thought furiously, as all the girls around Cho started doing it. She didn't, though. She said, Okay. and followed him out of earshot of her classmates. Harry turned to look at her, and his stomach gave a weird lurch, as though he had missed a step going downstairs. He said. He couldn't ask her. He couldn't. But he had to. Cho stood there looking puzzled, watching him. The words came out before Harry had quite got his tongue around them. "Want go ball with me?" "Sorry?" said Cho. Do you want to go to the ball with me?" said Harry. Why did he have to go red now? Why? "Oh," said Cho, and she went red too. "Oh, Harry, I'm really sorry." And she truly looked it. "I've already said I'll go with someone else." "Oh," said Harry. It was odd. A moment before, his insides had been writhing like snakes, but suddenly he didn't seem to have any insides at all. "Oh, okay," he said. "No problem." "I'm really sorry," she said again. "That's okay," said Harry. They stood there looking at each other. And then Cho said, "Well, yeah," said Harry. "Well, bye," said Cho, still very red. She walked away. Harry called after her before he could stop himself. "Who are you going with?" "Oh, Cedric," she said. "Cedric Diggory." "Oh, right," said Harry. His insides had come back again. It felt as though they had been filled with lead in their absence. Completely forgetting about dinner, he walked slowly back up to Gryffindor Tower, Cho's voice echoing in his ears with every step he took. Cedric Diggory. He had been starting to quite like Cedric, prepared to overlook the fact that he had once beaten him at Quidditch and was handsome and popular and nearly everyone's favorite champion. Now he suddenly realized that Cedric was in fact a useless pretty boy who didn't have enough brains to fill an egg cup. "Fairy lights," he said dully to the fat lady. The password had been changed the previous day. "Yes, indeed, dear," she trilled, straightening her new tinsel hairband as she swung forward to admit him. Entering the common room, Harry looked around, and to his surprise he saw Ron sitting ashen-faced in a distant corner. Ginny was sitting with him, talking to him in what seemed to be a low, soothing voice. "What's up, Ron?" said Harry, joining them. Ron looked up at Harry, a sort of blind horror in his face. "Why did I do it?" he said wildly. "I don't know what made me do it." "What?" said Harry. He just asked Fleur Delacour to go to the ball with him," said Ginny. She looked as though she was fighting back a smile, but she kept patting Ron's arm sympathetically. "You what?" said Harry. "I don't know what made me do it," Ron gasped again. "What was I playing at? There were people all around. I've gone mad. Everyone watching. I was just walking past her in the entrance hall. She was standing there talking to Diggory, and it sort of came over me, and I asked her." Ron moaned and put his face in his hands. He kept talking, though the words were barely distinguishable. "She looked at me like I was a sea slug or something, didn't even answer, and then, I don't know, I just sort of came to my senses and ran for it." "She's part Vila," said Harry. "You were right, her grandmother was one. It wasn't your fault. I bet you just walked past when she was turning on the old charm for Diggory and got a blast of it. But she was wasting her time. He's going with Cho Chang." Ron looked up. "I asked her to go with me just now," Harry said dully, "and she told me." Ginny had suddenly stopped smiling. "This is mad," said Ron. "We're the only ones left who haven't got anyone. Well, except Neville. Hey, guess who he asked? Hermione." "What?" said Harry, completely distracted by this startling news. "Yeah, I know," said Ron, some of the color coming back into his face as he started to laugh. "He told me after potions, said she's always been really nice, helping him out with work and stuff. But she told him she was already going with someone. Ha, as if. She just didn't want to go with Neville. I mean, who would?" "Don't," said Ginny, annoyed. "Don't laugh." Just then Hermione climbed into the portrait hole. "Why weren't you two at dinner?" she said, coming over to join them. "Because "Oh, shut up laughing, you two, because they've both just been turned down by girls they asked to the ball," said Ginny. That shut Harry and Ron up. "Thanks a bunch, Ginny," said Ron sourly. "All the good-looking ones taken, Ron," said Hermione loftily. "Eloise Midgen starting to look quite pretty now, is she? Well, I'm sure you'll find someone somewhere who will have you." But Ron was staring at Hermione, as though suddenly seeing her in a whole new light. "Hermione, Neville's right. You are a girl." "Oh, well spotted," she said acidly. "Well, you can come with one of us." "No, I can't," snapped Hermione. "Oh, come on," he said impatiently. "We need partners. We're going to look really stupid if we haven't got any. Everyone else has." "I can't come with you," said Hermione, now blushing, "because I'm already going with someone." "No, you're not," said Ron. "You just said that to get rid of Neville." "Oh, did I?" said Hermione, and her eyes flashed dangerously. "Just because it's taken you 3 years to notice, Ron, doesn't mean no one else has spotted I'm a girl." Ron stared at her. Then he grinned again. Okay, we know you're a girl," he said. "That do? Will you come now?" "I've already told you," Hermione said very angrily. "I'm going with someone else." And she stormed off toward the girls' dormitories again. "She's lying," said Ron flatly, watching her go. "She's not," said Ginny quietly. "Who is it then?" said Ron sharply. "I'm not telling you, it's her business," said Ginny. "Right," said Ron, who looked extremely put out. "This is getting stupid. Ginny, you can go with Harry, and I'll just—" "I can't," said Ginny, and she went scarlet too. "I'm going with Neville. He asked me when Hermione said no, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to go otherwise. I'm not in 4th year." She looked extremely miserable. "I think I'll go and have dinner," she said, and she got up and walked off to the portrait hole, her head bowed. Ron goggled at Harry. "What's got into them?" he demanded. But Harry had just seen Parvati and Lavender come in through the portrait hole. The time had come for drastic action. "Wait here," he said to Ron, and he stood up, walked straight up to Parvati, and said, "Parvati, will you go to the ball with me?" Parvati went into a fit of giggles. Harry waited for them to subside, his fingers crossed in the pocket of his robes. "Yes, all right then," she said finally, blushing furiously. "Thanks," said Harry in relief. "Lavender, will you go with Ron?" "She's going with Seamus," said Parvati, and the pair of them giggled harder than ever. Harry sighed. "Can't you think of anyone who'd go with Ron?" he said, lowering his voice so that Ron wouldn't hear. "What about Hermione Granger?" said Parvati. "She's going with someone else." Parvati looked astonished. "Who? Who?" she said keenly. Harry shrugged. "No idea," he said. "So what about Ron?" "Well," said Parvati slowly, "I suppose my sister might. Padma, you know, in Ravenclaw." "I'll ask her if you like." "Yeah, that would be great," said Harry. "Let me know, will you?" And he went back over to Ron, feeling that this ball was a lot more trouble than it was worth, and hoping very much that Padma Patil's nose was dead center. Chapter 23. The Yule Ball. Despite the very heavy load of homework that the 4th years had been given for the holidays, Harry was in no mood to work when term ended, and spent the week leading up to Christmas enjoying himself as fully as possible along with everyone else. Gryffindor Tower was hardly less crowded now than during term time. It seemed to have shrunk slightly too, as its inhabitants were being so much rowdier than usual. Fred and George had had a great success with their canary creams, and for the first couple of days of the holidays, people kept bursting into feather all over the place. Before long, however, all the Gryffindors had learned to treat food anybody else offered them with extreme caution, in case it had a canary cream concealed in the center, and George confided to Harry that he and Fred were now working on developing something else. Harry made a mental note never to accept so much as a crisp from Fred and George in future. He still hadn't forgotten Dudley and the Tung-Tung toffee. Snow was falling thickly upon the castle and its grounds now. The pale blue Beaubaton carriage looked like a large, chilly, frosted pumpkin next to the iced gingerbread house that was Hagrid's cabin, while the Durmstrang ship's portholes were glazed with ice, the rigging white with frost. The house elves down in the kitchen were outdoing themselves with a series of rich, warming stews and savory puddings, and only Fleur Delacour seemed to be able to find anything to complain about. "It is too heavy, oh, this Hogwarts food," they heard her saying grumpily as they left the great hall behind her one evening. Ron skulking behind Harry, keen not to be spotted by Fleur. "I will not fit into my dress robes." "Oh, there's a tragedy," Hermione snapped as Fleur went out into the entrance hall. "She really thinks a lot of herself, that one, doesn't she?" "Hermione, who are you going to the ball with?" said Ron. He kept springing this question on her, hoping to startle her into a response by asking it when she least expected it. However, Hermione merely frowned and said, "I'm not telling you. You'll just make fun of me." "You're joking, Weasley," said Malfoy behind him. "You're not telling me someone's asked that to the ball. Not the long-molared mudblood." Harry and Ron both whipped around, but Hermione said loudly, waving to somebody over Malfoy's shoulder, "Hello, Professor Moody." Malfoy went pale and jumped backward, looking wildly around for Moody. But he was still up at the staff table, finishing his stew. "Twitchy little ferret, aren't you, Malfoy?" said Hermione scathingly, and she, Harry, and Ron went up the marble staircase, laughing heartily. "Hermione," said Ron, looking sideways at her, suddenly frowning. "Your teeth. What about them?" she said. "Well, they're different. I've just noticed." "Of course they are. Did you expect me to keep those fangs Malfoy gave me?" "No, I mean, they're different to how they were before he put that hex on you. They're all straight and normal-sized." Hermione suddenly smiled very mischievously, and Harry noticed it too. It was a very different smile from the one he remembered. "Well, when I went up to Madame Pomfrey to get them shrunk, she held up a mirror and told me to stop her when they were back to how they normally were," she said, "and I just let her carry on a bit." She smiled even more widely. "Mom and Dad won't be too pleased. I've been trying to persuade them to let me shrink them for ages, but they wanted me to carry on with my braces. You know, they're dentists. They just don't think teeth and magic should... Look, Pigwidgeon's back." Ron's tiny owl was twittering madly on the top of the icicle-laden banisters, a scroll of parchment tied to his leg. People passing him were pointing and laughing, and a group of third-year girls paused and said, "Oh, look at the weeny owl. Isn't he cute?" "Stupid little feathery git," Ron hissed, hurrying up the stairs and snatching up Pigwidgeon. "You bring letters to the addressee. You don't hang around showing off." Pigwidgeon hooted happily, his head protruding over Ron's fist. The third-year girls all looked very shocked. "Clear off," Ron snapped at them, waving the fist holding Pigwidgeon, who hooted more happily than ever as he soared through the air. "Here, take it, Harry," Ron added in an undertone as the third-year girls scuttled away looking scandalized. He pulled Sirius's reply off Pigwidgeon's leg. Harry pocketed it, and they hurried back to Gryffindor Tower to read it. Everyone in the common room was much too busy in letting off more holiday steam to observe what anyone else was up to. Ron, Harry, and Hermione sat apart from everyone else by a dark window that was gradually filling up with snow, and Harry read out, "Dear Harry, congratulations on getting past the Horntail. Whoever put your name in that goblet shouldn't be feeling too happy right now. I was going to suggest a conjunctivitis curse, as a dragon's eyes are its weakest point." "That's what Crumbig," Hermione whispered. "But your way was better. I'm impressed." "Don't get complacent, though, Harry. You've only done one task. Whoever put you in for the tournament's got plenty more opportunity if they're trying to hurt you. Keep your eyes open, particularly when the person we discussed is around, and concentrate on keeping yourself out of trouble. Keep in touch. I still want to hear about anything unusual." "Sirius." "He sounds exactly like Moody," said Harry quietly, tucking the letter away again inside his robes. "Constant vigilance. You'd think I walk around with my eyes shut, banging off the walls." "But he's right, Harry," said Hermione. "You have still got 2 tasks to do. You really ought to have a look at that egg, you know, and start working out what it means." "Hermione, he's got ages," snapped Ron. "On a game of chess, Harry?" "Yeah, okay," said Harry. Then, spotting the look on Hermione's face, he said, "Come on, how am I supposed to concentrate with all this noise going on? I won't even be able to hear the egg over this lot." "Oh, I suppose not," she sighed, and she sat down to watch their chess match, which culminated in an exciting checkmate of Ron's, involving a couple of recklessly brave pawns and a very violent bishop. Harry awoke very suddenly on Christmas Day. Wondering what had caused his abrupt return to consciousness, he opened his eyes and saw something with very large, round, green eyes staring back at him in the darkness, so close they were almost nose to nose. "Dobby!" Harry yelled, scrambling away from the elf so fast he almost fell out of bed. "Don't do that!" "Dobby is sorry, sir," squeaked Dobby anxiously, jumping backward with his long fingers over his mouth. "Dobby is only wanting to wish Harry Potter Merry Christmas and bring him a present, sir. Harry Potter didn't say Dobby could come and see him sometimes, sir." "It's okay," said Harry, still breathing rather faster than usual, while his heart rate returned to normal. Just prod me or something in future, all right? Don't bend over me like that." Harry pulled back the curtains around his 4-poster, took his glasses from his bedside table, and put them on. His yell had awoken Ron, Seamus, Dean, and Neville. All of them were peering through the gaps in their own hangings, heavy-eyed and tousle-haired. "Someone attacking you, Harry?" Seamus asked sleepily. "No, it's just Dobby," Harry muttered. "Go back to sleep." "Nah, presents," said Seamus, spotting the large pile at the foot of his bed. Ron, Dean, and Neville decided that now they were awake, they might as well get down to some present opening too. Harry turned back to Dobby, who was now standing nervously next to Harry's bed, still looking worried that he had upset Harry. There was a Christmas bauble tied to the loop on top of his tea cozy. "Can Dobby give Harry Potter his present?" he squeaked tentatively. "Course you can," said Harry. I've got something for you too." It was a lie. He hadn't bought anything for Dobby at all, but he quickly opened his trunk and pulled out a particularly knobbly rolled-up pair of socks. They were his oldest and foulest, mustard yellow, and had once belonged to Uncle Vernon. The reason they were extra knobbly was that Harry had been using them to cushion his sneakoscope for over a year now. He pulled out the sneakoscope and handed the socks to Dobby, saying, "Sorry, I forgot to wrap them." But Dobby was utterly delighted. "Socks are Dobby's favorite clothes, sir," he said, ripping off his odd ones and pulling on Uncle Vernon's. "I has 7 now, sir. But, sir," he said, his eyes widening, having pulled both socks up to their highest extent, so that they reached to the bottom of his shorts. "They has made a mistake in the shop, Harry Potter. They is giving you 2 the same." "Ah, no, Harry. How come you didn't spot that?" said Ron, grinning over from his own bed, which was now strewn with wrapping paper. "Tell you what, Dobby, here you go. Take these 2, and you can mix them up properly. And here's your sweater." He threw Dobby a pair of violet socks he had just unwrapped, and the hand-knitted sweater Mrs. Weasley had sent. Dobby looked quite overwhelmed. "Sir, he's very kind," he squeaked, his eyes brimming with tears again, bowing deeply to Ron. Dobby knew Sir must be a great wizard, for he is Harry Potter's greatest friend. But Dobby did not know that he was also as generous of spirit, as noble, as selfless. "They're only socks," said Ron, who had gone slightly pink around the ears, though he looked rather pleased all the same. "Wow, Harry." He had just opened Harry's present, a Chudley cannon hat. "Cool." He jammed it onto his head, where it clashed horribly with his hair. Dobby now handed Harry a small package, which turned out to be socks. "Dobby is making them himself, sir," the elf said happily. "He is buying the wool out of his wages, sir." The left sock was bright red and had a pattern of broomsticks upon it. The right sock was green with a pattern of snitches. They're really... "Well, thanks, Dobby," said Harry, and he pulled them on, causing Dobby's eyes to leak with happiness again. "Dobby must go now, sir. We is already making Christmas dinner in the kitchens," said Dobby, and he hurried out of the dormitory, waving goodbye to Ron and the others as he passed. Harry's other presents were much more satisfactory than Dobby's odd socks, with the obvious exception of the Dursleys, which consisted of a single tissue, an all-time low. Harry supposed they, too, were remembering the Tun-Tun Toffee. Hermione had given Harry a book called Quidditch Teams of Britain and Ireland, Ron a bulging bag of Dun bombs, Sirius a handy penknife with attachments to unlock any lock and undo any knot, and Hagrid a vast box of sweets, including all Harry's favorites: Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, chocolate frogs, Grubel's best blowing gum, and fizzing Whizbees. There was also, of course, Mrs. Weasley's usual package, including a new sweater, green, with a picture of a dragon on it. Harry supposed Charlie had told her all about the horntail, and a large quantity of homemade mince pies. Harry and Ron met up with Hermione in the common room, and they went down to breakfast together. They spent most of the morning in Gryffindor Tower, where everyone was enjoying their presents, then returned to the Great Hall for a magnificent lunch, which included at least 100 turkeys and Christmas puddings, and large piles of Cribbag's wizarding crackers. They went out onto the grounds in the afternoon. The snow was untouched, except for the deep channels made by the Durmstrang and Beauxbaton students on their way up to the castle. Hermione chose to watch Harry and the Weasleys snowball fight rather than join in, and at 5 o'clock said she was going back upstairs to get ready for the ball. "What, you need 3 hours?" said Ron, looking at her incredulously, and paying for his lapse in concentration when a large snowball, thrown by George, hit him hard on the side of the head. "Who are you going with?" he yelled after Hermione, but she just waved and disappeared up the stone steps into the castle. There was no Christmas tea today, as the ball included a feast, so at 7 o'clock, when it had become hard to aim properly, the others abandoned their snowball fight and trooped back to the common room. The fat lady was sitting in her frame with her friend Violet from downstairs, both of them extremely tipsy, empty boxes of chocolate liqueurs littering the bottom of her picture. "Larry fights, that's the one," she giggled when they gave the password, and she swung forward to let them inside. Harry, Ron, Seamus, Dean, and Neville changed into their dress robes up in their dormitory, all of them looking very self-conscious, but none as much as Ron, who surveyed himself in the long mirror in the corner with an appalled look on his face. There was just no getting around the fact that his robes looked more like a dress than anything else. In a desperate attempt to make them look more manly, he used a severing charm on the ruff and cuffs. It worked fairly well. At least he was now lace-free, although he hadn't done a very neat job, and the edges still looked depressingly frayed as the boys set off downstairs. "I still can't work out how you two got the best-looking girls in the year," muttered Dean. "Animal magnetism," said Ron gloomily, pulling stray threads out of his cuffs. The common room looked strange. full of people wearing different colors instead of the usual mass of black. Parvati was waiting for Harry at the foot of the stairs. She looked very pretty indeed, in robes of shocking pink, with her long dark plait braided with gold, and gold bracelets glimmering at her wrists. Harry was relieved to see that she wasn't giggling. "You, look nice," he said awkwardly. "Thanks," she said. "Padma's going to meet you in the entrance hall," she added to Ron. "Right," said Ron, looking around. "Where's Hermione?" Parvati shrugged. "Shall we go down then, Harry?" "Okay," said Harry, wishing he could just stay in the common room. Fred winked at Harry as he passed him on the way out of the portrait hall. The entrance hall was packed with students too, all milling around waiting for 8 o'clock, when the doors to the great hall would be thrown open. Those people who were meeting partners from different houses were edging through the crowd, trying to find one another. Parvati found her sister Padma and led her over to Harry and Ron. "Hi," said Padma, who was looking just as pretty as Parvati in robes of bright turquoise. She didn't look too enthusiastic about having Ron as a partner, though. Her dark eyes lingered on the frayed neck and sleeves of his dress robes as she looked him up and down. "Hi," said Ron, not looking at her, but staring around at the crowd. "Oh no!" He bent his knees slightly to hide behind Harry, because Fleur Delacour was passing, looking stunning in robes of silver-gray satin, and accompanied by the Ravenclaw Quidditch captain Roger Davies. When they had disappeared, Ron stood straight again and stared over the heads of the crowd. "Where is Hermione?" he said again. A group of Slytherins came up the steps from their dungeon common room. Malfoy was in front. He was wearing dress robes of black velvet with a high collar, which in Harry's opinion made him look like a vicar. Pansy Parkinson, in very frilly robes of pale pink, was clutching Malfoy's arm. Crabbe and Goyle were both wearing green. They resembled moss-colored boulders, and neither of them, Harry was pleased to see, had managed to find a partner. The oak front doors opened, and everyone turned to look as the Durmstrang students entered with Professor Karkaroff. Crumb was at the front of the party, accompanied by a pretty girl in blue robes Harry didn't know. Over their heads, he saw that an area of lawn right in front of the castle had been transformed into a sort of grotto full of fairy lights, meaning hundreds of actual living fairies were sitting in the rose bushes that had been conjured there, and fluttering over the statues of what seemed to be Father Christmas and his reindeer. Then Professor McGonagall's voice called, "Champions, over here, please." Parvati readjusted her bandals, beaming. She and Harry said, "See you in a minute," to Ron and Padma, and walked forward, the chattering crowd parting to let them through. Professor McGonagall, who was wearing dress robes of red tartan and had arranged a rather ugly wreath of thistles around the brim of her hat, told them to wait on one side of the doors while everyone else went inside. They were to enter the Great Hall in procession when the rest of the students had sat down. Fleur Delacour and Roger Davies stationed themselves nearest the doors. Davies looked so stunned by his good fortune in having Fleur for a partner that he could hardly take his eyes off her. Cedric and Cho were close to Harry too. He looked away from them so he wouldn't have to talk to them. His eyes fell instead on the girl next to Crumb. His jaw dropped. It was Hermione. But she didn't look like Hermione at all. She had done something with her hair. It was no longer bushy, but sleek and shiny, and twisted up into an elegant knot at the back of her head. She was wearing robes made of a floaty periwinkle blue material, and she was holding herself differently somehow. Or maybe it was merely the absence of the 20 or so books she usually had slung over her back. She was also smiling, rather nervously it was true, but the reduction in size of her front teeth was more noticeable than ever. Harry couldn't understand how he hadn't spotted it before. "Hi, Harry," she said. "Hi, Parvati." Parvati was gazing at Hermione in unflattering disbelief. She wasn't the only one either. When the doors to the great hall opened, Crumb's fan club from the library stalked past, throwing Hermione looks of deepest loathing. Pansy Parkinson gaped at her as she walked by with Malfoy, and even he didn't seem to be able to find an insult to throw at her. Ron, however, walked right past Hermione without looking at her. Once everyone else was settled in the hall, Professor McGonagall told the champions and their partners to get in line in pairs and to follow her. They did so, and everyone in the great hall applauded as they entered and started walking up toward a large round table at the top of the hall, where the judges were sitting. The walls of the hall had all been covered in sparkling silver frost, with hundreds of garlands of mistletoe and ivy crossing the starry black ceiling. The house tables had vanished. Instead, there were about 100 smaller lantern-lit ones, each seating about a dozen people. Harry concentrated on not tripping over his feet. Parvati seemed to be enjoying herself. She was beaming around at everybody, steering Harry so forcefully that he felt as though he were a show dog she was putting through its paces. He caught sight of Ron and Padma as he neared the top table. Ron was watching Hermione pass with narrowed eyes. Padma was looking sulky. Dumbledore smiled happily as the champions approached the top table, but Karkaroff wore an expression remarkably like Ron's as he watched Krum and Hermione draw nearer. Ludo Bagman, tonight in robes of bright purple with large yellow stars, was clapping as enthusiastically as any of the students, and Madame Maxime, who had changed her usual uniform of black satin for a flowing gown of lavender silk, was applauding them politely. But Mr. Crouch, Harry suddenly realized, was not there. The fifth seat at the table was occupied by Percy Weasley. When the champions and their partners reached the table, Percy drew out the empty chair beside him, staring pointedly at Harry. Harry took the hint and sat down next to Percy, who was wearing brand-new navy blue dress robes and an expression of such smugness that Harry thought it ought to be fine. "I've been promoted," Percy said, before Harry could even ask, and from his tone, he might have been announcing his election as supreme ruler of the universe. "I'm now Mr. Crouch's personal assistant, and I'm here representing him." "Why didn't he come?" Harry asked. He wasn't looking forward to being lectured on cauldron bottoms all through dinner. "I'm afraid to say Mr. Crouch isn't well. Not well at all. Hasn't been right since the World Cup. Hardly surprising. Overwork. He's not as young as he was, though still quite brilliant, of course. The mind remains as great as it ever was. But the World Cup was a fiasco for the whole ministry. And then Mr. Crouch suffered a huge personal shock with the misbehavior of that house elf of his, Blinky, or whatever she was called. Naturally, he dismissed her immediately afterward, but, well, as I say, he's getting on. He needs looking after, and I think he's found a definite drop in his home comforts since she left. And then we have the tournament to arrange, and the aftermath of the cup to deal with. That revolting Skeeter woman buzzing around. No, poor man, he's having a well-earned, quiet Christmas. I'm just glad he knew he had someone he could rely upon to take his place." Harry wanted very much to ask whether Mr. Crouch had stopped calling Percy Weatherby yet, but resisted the temptation. There was no food as yet on the glittering golden plates, but small menus were lying in front of each of them. Harry picked his up uncertainly and looked around. There were no waiters. Dumbledore, however, looked carefully down at his own menu, then said very clearly to his plate, "Pork chops." And pork chops appeared. Getting the idea, the rest of the table placed their orders with their plates too. Harry glanced up at Hermione to see how she felt about this new and more complicated method of dining. Surely it meant plenty of extra work for the house elves. But for once, Hermione didn't seem to be thinking about SPEW. She was deep in talk with Victor Krum, and hardly seemed to notice what she was eating. It now occurred to Harry that he had never actually heard Krum speak before, but he was certainly talking now, and very enthusiastically at that. "Well, we have a casaloso. Not as big as this, not as comfortable, I am thinking, he was telling Hermione. We have just 4 floors, and the fires are lit only for magical purposes. But we have grounds larger even than these, though in winter we have very little daylight, so we are not enjoying them. But in summer we are flying every day over the lakes and the mountains. Now, Victor, said Karkaroff with a laugh that didn't reach his cold eyes. Don't go giving away anything else now, or your charming friend will know exactly where to find us. Dumbledore smiled, his eyes twinkling. Igor, all this secrecy. One would almost think you didn't want visitors. Well, Dumbledore, said Karkaroff, displaying his yellowing teeth to their fullest extent, we are all protective of our private domains, are we not? Do we not jealously guard the halls of learning that have been entrusted to us? Are we not right to be proud that we alone know our school's secrets, and right to protect them? Oh, I would never dream of assuming I know all Hogwarts secrets, Igor, said Dumbledore amicably. Only this morning, for instance, I took a wrong turning on the way to the bathroom, and found myself in a beautifully proportioned room I have never seen before, containing a really rather magnificent collection of chamber pots. When I went back to investigate more closely, I discovered that the room had vanished, but I must keep an eye out for it. Possibly it is only accessible at 5:30 in the morning, or it may only appear at the quarter moon, or when the seeker has an exceptionally full bladder. Harry snorted into his plate of goulash. Percy frowned, but Harry could have sworn Dumbledore had given him a very small wink. Meanwhile, Fleur Delacour was criticizing the Hogwarts decorations to Roger Davies. This is nothing, she said dismissively, looking around at the sparkling walls of the great hall. At the Palace of Beauxbaton, we have ice sculptures all around the dining chamber at Christmas. They do not melt, of course. They are like huge statues of diamond glittering around the place, and the food is simply superb. And we have choirs of wood nymphs who serenade us as we eat. We have none of this ugly armor in the halls, and if a poltergeist ever entered into Beauxbaton, he would be expelled like that. She slapped her hand onto the table impatiently. Roger Davies was watching her talk with a very dazed look on his face, and he kept missing his mouth with his fork. Harry had the impression that Davies was too busy staring at Fleur to take in a word she was saying. Absolutely right, he said quickly, slapping his own hand down on the table in imitation of Fleur. Like that, yeah. Harry looked around the hall. Hagrid was sitting at one of the other staff tables. He was back in his horrible hairy brown suit and gazing up at the top table. Harry saw him give a small wave, and looking around, saw Madame Maxime return it, her opals glittering in the candlelight. Hermione was now teaching Krum to say her name properly. He kept calling her Hermione. Hermione, she said, slowly and clearly. Hermione. Close enough, she said, catching Harry's eye and grinning. When all the food had been consumed, Dumbledore stood up and asked the students to do the same. Then, with a wave of his wand, all the tables zoomed back along the walls, leaving the floor clear, and then he conjured a raised platform into existence along the right wall. A set of drums, several guitars, a lute, a cello, and some bagpipes were set upon it. The Weird Sisters now trooped up onto the stage to wildly enthusiastic applause. They were all extremely hairy and dressed in black robes that had been artfully ripped and torn. They picked up their instruments, and Harry, who had been so interested in watching them that he had almost forgotten what was coming, suddenly realized that the lanterns on all the other tables had gone out, and that the other champions and their partners were standing up. "Come on," Parvati hissed. "We're supposed to dance." Harry tripped over his dress robes as he stood up. The weird sisters struck up a slow, mournful tune. Harry walked onto the brightly lit dance floor, carefully avoiding catching anyone's eye. He could see Seamus and Dean waving at him and sniggering. And next moment, Parvati had seized his hands, placed one around her waist, and was holding the other tightly in hers. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, Harry thought, revolving slowly on the spot. Parvati was staring. He kept his eyes fixed over the heads of the watching people, and very soon many of them too had come onto the dance floor, so that the champions were no longer the center of attention. Neville and Ginny were dancing nearby. He could see Ginny wincing frequently as Neville trod on her feet, and Dumbledore was waltzing with Madame Maxime. He was so dwarfed by her that the top of his pointed hat barely tickled her chin. However, she moved very gracefully for a woman so large. Mad-Eye Moody was doing an extremely ungainly two-step with Professor Sinistra, who was nervously avoiding his wooden leg. "Nice socks, Potter," Moody growled as he passed, his magical eyes staring through Harry's robes. "Oh, yeah, Dobby the house elf knitted them for me," said Harry, grinning. "He is so creepy," Parvati whispered as Moody clumped away. "I don't think that I should be allowed." Harry heard the final quavering note from the bagpipe with relief. The weird sisters stopped playing. Applause filled the hall once more, and Harry let go of Parvati at once. "Let's sit down, shall we?" "Oh, but this is a really good one," Parvati said as the weird sisters struck up a new song, which was much faster. "No, I don't like it," Harry lied, and he led her away from the dance floor, past Fred and Angelina, who were dancing so exuberantly that people around them were backing away in fear of injury, and over to the table where Ron and Padma were sitting. "How's it going?" Harry asked Ron, sitting down and opening a bottle of butterbeer. Ron didn't answer. He was glaring at Hermione and Crumb, who were dancing nearby. Padma was sitting with her arms and legs crossed, one foot jiggling in time to the music. Every now and then, she threw a disgruntled look at Ron, who was completely ignoring her. Parvati sat down on Harry's other side, crossed her arms and legs too, and within minutes was asked to dance by a boy from Beaubaton. "You don't mind, do you, Harry?" Parvati said. "What?" said Harry, who was now watching Cho and Cedric. "Oh, never mind," snapped Parvati, and she went off with the boy from Beaubaton. When the song ended, she did not return. Hermione came over and sat down in Parvati's empty chair. She was a bit pink in the face from dancing. "Hi," said Harry. Ron didn't say anything. "It's hot, isn't it?" said Hermione, fanning herself with her hand. "Victor's just gone to get some drinks." Ron gave her a withering look. "Victor?" he said. "Hasn't he asked you to call him Vicky yet?" Hermione looked at him in surprise. "What's up with you?" she said. "If you don't know," said Ron scathingly, "I'm not going to tell you." Hermione stared at him, then at Harry, who shrugged. "Ron, what?" "He's from Durmstrang," spat Ron. "He's competing against Harry, against Hogwarts. You're—" Ron was obviously casting around for words strong enough to describe Hermione's kind. "Fraternizing with the enemy, that's what you're doing." Hermione's mouth fell open. "Don't be so stupid," she said after a moment. "The enemy. Honestly, who was the one who was all excited when they saw him arrive? Who was the one who wanted his autograph? Who's got a model of him up in their dormitory?" Ron chose to ignore this. "I suppose he asked you to come with him while you were built in the library?" "Yes, he did," said Hermione, the pink patches on her cheeks glowing more brightly. "So what?" "What happened? Trying to get him to join Spew, were you?" "No, I wasn't. If you really want to know, he said he'd been coming up to the library every day to try and talk to me, but he hadn't been able to pluck up the courage." Hermione said this very quickly, and blushed so deeply that she was the same color as Parvati's robes.
"Yeah, well, that's his story," said Ron nastily. "And what's that supposed to mean?"
"Obvious, isn't it? He's Karkaroff's student, isn't he?
He knows who you hang around with. He's just trying to get closer to Harry, get inside information on him, or get near enough to jinx him."
Hermione looked as though Ron had slapped her. When she spoke, her voice quivered.
"For your information, he hasn't asked me one single thing about Harry. Not one."
Ron changed tack at the speed of light.
"Then he's hoping you'll help him find out what his egg means. I suppose you've been putting your heads together during those cozy little library sessions." "I'd never help him work out that egg," said Hermione, looking outraged. "Never. How could you say something like that? I want Harry to win the tournament. Harry knows that, don't you, Harry?"
"You've got a funny way of showing it," sneered Ron.
"This whole tournament's supposed to be about getting to know foreign wizards and making friends with them," said Hermione hotly. "No, it isn't," shouted Ron. "It's about winning."
People were starting to stare at them. "Ron," said Harry quietly, "I haven't got a problem with Hermione coming with Krum." But Ron ignored Harry too.
"Why don't you go and find Vicky? He'll be wondering where you are," said Ron. "Don't call him Vicky."
Hermione jumped to her feet and stormed off across the dance floor, disappearing into the crowd. Ron watched her go with a mixture of anger and satisfaction on his face. "Are you going to ask me to dance at all?" Padma asked him.
"No," said Ron, still glaring after Hermione.
"Fine," snapped Padma, and she got up and went to join Parvati and the Beauxbatons boy, who conjured up one of his friends to join them so fast that Harry could have sworn he had zoomed him there by a summoning charm.
"Where is Hermione?"
said a voice. Krum had just arrived at their table, clutching 2 butterbeers.
"No idea,"
said Ron mulishly, looking up at him.
"Lost her, have you?"
Krum was looking surly again.
"Well, if you see her, tell her I have drinks," he said, and he slouched off.
"Made friends with Victor Krum, have you, Ron?" Percy had bustled over, rubbing his hands together and looking extremely pompous.
"Excellent. That's the whole point, you know. International magical cooperation."
To Harry's displeasure, Percy now took Padma's vacated seat. The top table was now empty. Professor Dumbledore was dancing with Professor Sprout, Ludo Bagman with Professor McGonagall. Madame Maxime and Hagrid were cutting a wide path around the dance floor as they waltzed through the students, and Karkaroff was nowhere to be seen. When the next song ended, everybody applauded once more, and Harry saw Ludo Bagman kiss Professor McGonagall's hand and make his way back through the crowds, at which point Fred and George accosted him.
"What do they think they're doing, annoying senior ministry members?"
Percy hissed, watching Fred and George suspiciously. "No respect." Ludo Bagman shook off Fred and George fairly quickly, however, and spotting Harry, waved and came over to their table. "I hope my brothers weren't bothering you, Mr. Bagman," said Percy at once.
"What? Oh, not at all," said Bagman. "No, they were just telling me a bit more about those fake wands of theirs, wondering if I could advise them on the marketing. I've promised to put them in touch with a couple of contacts of mine at Zonko's Joke Shop."
Percy didn't look happy about this at all, and Harry was prepared to bet he would be rushing to tell Mrs. Weasley about this the moment he got home. Apparently, Fred and George's plans had grown even more ambitious lately, if they were hoping to sell to the public. Bagman opened his mouth to ask Harry something, but Percy diverted him. "How do you feel the tournament's going, Mr. Bagman? Our department's quite satisfied. The hitch with the Goblet of Fire," he glanced at Harry, "was a little unfortunate, of course, but it seems to have gone very smoothly since, don't you think?"
"Oh, yes," Bagman said cheerfully. "It's all been enormous fun. How's old Barty doing? Shame he couldn't come."
"Oh, I'm sure Mr. Crouch will be up and about in no time," said Percy importantly. "But in the meantime, I'm more than willing to take up the slack." Of course, it's not all attending balls. He laughed airily. Oh, no. I've had to deal with all sorts of things that have cropped up in his absence. You heard Ali Bashir was caught smuggling a consignment of flying carpets into the country? And then we've been trying to persuade the Transylvanians to sign the international ban on dueling. I've got a meeting with their head of magical cooperation in the new year. Let's go for a walk, Ron muttered to Harry. Get away from Percy. Pretending they wanted more drinks, Harry and Ron left the table, edged around the dance floor,